There is a room inside every royal institution that does not appear on any official floor plan. No one names it. No memo references it. The people who work inside it would describe their occupation in terms so ordinary that the description becomes a kind of concealment. They manage communications, they handle the press, they protect the family. What they protect the family from is never quite stated in those terms. For most of the first decade of the 21st century, a young woman named Chelsy Davy existed inside that room. She was real. She was loved by a prince who had very little else that belonged to him alone, and the institution she had wandered into decided, with the efficiency that old institutions perfect over generations, that she should not exist publicly at all. She had arrived there by the simplest possible route, by loving someone who was very difficult to love. This is the story of those years. Prince Harry was 20 years old when Chelsy Davy entered his life. He was not yet the figure the world would later argue about, or the man who would write a memoir that made his family flinch, or sit beside his wife in an interview that divided a country. He was a young man who had buried his mother at the age of 12, grown up inside a machinery of image control, so sophisticated it had developed its own vocabulary, and arrived at adulthood carrying wounds the institution around him was far better at concealing than at healing. Chelsy was 21. She had grown up in Zimbabwe and South Africa, the daughter of a wealthy game farmer. She was not English. She was not aristocratic in the way the palace preferred its women to arrive. She had opinions she stated without softening them, a laugh that did not arrive on schedule, and the particular confidence of someone who had not been raised inside the rules she was now expected to follow. The palace looked at her and began calculating. What followed had no single originating moment, no one meeting in one room where someone drew a line through her name. It was slower than that, more institutional, more polite. The kind of suppression that does not announce itself because everyone involved believes they are simply doing their job correctly. For almost 2 years, Chelsy Davy's relationship with Prince Harry remained one of the worst-kept secrets in Britain that the British press was nonetheless not printing. The machinery of Kensington Palace communicated its preferences the way institutions always do, by controlling access, managing briefings, and making the consequences of non-cooperation understood without ever stating them directly. Harry did not fully understand what was being done to the person he loved, or to himself, until much later. The education came through the relationship itself, through its ending and its beginning again, and through the long pattern that followed. Chelsy first, then Cressida Bonas, then the woman who would finally refuse to accept the terms the institution offered. That refusal changed everything. Before it, there were the buried years. The years when a young woman from southern Africa sat beside a grieving prince and was told, in the vocabulary of palace management, that her presence was a complication. The years when Harry smiled for cameras at official engagements and returned to a private life the institution had decided the public should not see. Those years shaped him more than anyone around him understood. This is where that story begins. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Henry Charles Albert David Windsor was born on the 15th of September 1984 into a family that had already decided what he was for. His brother William had arrived 2 years earlier and absorbed the full weight of what the monarchy demands from its future kings. The ceremonies, the expectations, the particular attention that follows a child who will one day be asked to carry a crown. William had all of that before Harry could speak. By the time Harry arrived, the institutional machinery had already identified its heir and was preparing accordingly. Harry was the second son, the spare. The word sounds medieval because it is medieval, and the institution that used it had never seen a compelling reason to retire it. This was not cruelty. It was function. Monarchies need heirs, and they need contingencies, and the contingency is assigned that role with the same administrative efficiency that governs everything else in royal life. No one sat down and told Harry in direct language what his position meant. That would have been too honest, and royal institutions rarely communicate honestly when they can communicate symbolically instead. The message arrived through 100 smaller signals. Which events William attended and which Harry attended. Whose education received more institutional attention, whose future was discussed in terms of preparation, and whose was discussed in terms of management. Harry absorbed those signals the way children absorb everything, not through analysis, but through feeling, through the gradual accumulation of moments that together form a child's understanding of where they stand. Where he stood was beside his brother, always slightly to the left of the frame, present but not primary. In the early years, this was softened considerably by his mother. Diana, Princess of Wales, had by the mid-1980s become something the royal family had not encountered before, in its modern form, a member of the institution who understood intuitively how to exist inside it and outside it at the same time. She followed the protocols. She wore the clothes. She stood at the correct angle in the correct location at the correct events. She also held her children's hands in public, which the older generation of the family found mildly irregular, and took them to McDonald's and theme parks, and told them things about the world that the palace would not have included in any official curriculum. Her approach to Harry in particular had a specific quality that people who observed the family in those years often noted. She understood that the spare needed something the institution would not provide, a sense that his existence had weight, independent of his brothers. She gave him that in the way mothers give children things, through attention, through laughter, through the private language that families build when they are functioning as families rather than as institutions. Harry later said, in the memoir he published in January 2023, that his mother was the one person in his early childhood who made him feel genuinely seen. That is a particular kind of praise that carries inside it a particular kind of accusation about everyone else. The marriage between Charles and Diana had been failing for years before it failed in public. The children knew something was wrong long before anyone told them anything. Children always do. The household at Kensington Palace had the atmosphere that long unhappy households develop, a surface normality maintained through effort, and beneath it, the pressure of two people who had stopped being able to be in the same room without the air changing. Harry was 4 years old when his parents effectively separated in everything but legal terms. He was 6 when the private failures began becoming public knowledge. He was 7 when the Panorama interview aired, and his mother told a nation what her marriage had actually been. He sat, reportedly, in front of a television and watched. What a 7-year-old understands of a parent's confessions made to a journalist in a carefully lit room is not the content of the confession. It is the tone. It is the fact of the tears. It is the gap between the mother they know at home and the figure on the screen speaking about loneliness in a way that 7-year-olds understand means something has broken that cannot be put back. Harry was 12 years old on the 31st of August, 1997. He was at Balmoral, the royal family's Scottish estate, when the news arrived. The account he has given of that morning, across multiple interviews and in his memoir, describes a father arriving in his room before dawn, with the information delivered in the manner that the Windsor family delivers difficult information, with control, with brevity, with a formality that is sometimes mistaken for coldness and is sometimes simply coldness. His mother was dead. She had been killed in a car crash in Paris. She was 36 years old. Harry was 12. He had not seen her in several weeks. The last phone call between them, according to his later account, had been cut short because he wanted to get back to playing with his cousins. He has never stopped thinking about that. What happened to Harry in the weeks and months that followed his mother's death is both documented and largely misunderstood. The documented version focuses on the funeral, on the 2 boys walking behind the coffin down the streets of London, while the world watched and wept, and the boys did not cry publicly because they had been asked not to. It focuses on the flowers outside Kensington Palace, on the scale of national grief, on the extraordinary moment when a private family tragedy became a collective public event of a kind Britain had not experienced in living memory. The misunderstood version is what happened after the cameras left. The royal family's approach to grief has been shaped over generations by the particular requirements of an institution that cannot afford to appear disabled by human feeling. This is not a character flaw in the individuals involved, so much as an institutional pressure that predates all of them. The family had survived wars and abdications and constitutional crises by maintaining a posture of composure. That posture had become, over time, the family's primary emotional language. Composure was not merely expected, it was the only dialect available. For a 12-year-old boy who had just lost his mother, the institutional dialect was inadequate. Harry has said, across many years and many different platforms, that he was not offered grief counseling after Diana's death for approximately 2 years. He has said that the subject of his mother was rarely discussed in the family household. He has said that he learned in that period to do what the institution around him did, to keep moving, to keep the surface intact, to place the feeling somewhere internal where it would not be visible. The somewhere internal where he placed it did not process and dissolve, the way grief is supposed to move through a person over time. It compressed. It became, in Harry's own later description, a sustained state of emotional numbness that he carried through his teenage years, without identifying it as anything other than the way things were. He was sent to Eton College, the school that produces the particular kind of English confidence that looks identical to emotional unavailability from the outside. He made friends there who remember him as funny, warm, and capable of great loyalty. He also acquired, at Eton, the first of the habits that would later become tabloid material. He drank. He smoked. He attended parties that were not royal approved and was photographed at some of them in ways that were not royal approved. He was 16 when photographs of him at a party where cannabis had been present appeared in the press. The palace's response was managed with the efficiency that had by then become its defining characteristic. A statement was issued. The incident was contextualized as a youthful mistake. Charles visited a drug rehabilitation center with his son, a visit that was photographed and that communicated to the public that appropriate parental concern had been applied. The machinery absorbed the incident, processed it, and converted it into a narrative of responsible royal parenting. Harry, at 16, watched his father visit a drug rehabilitation center for the cameras because his son had been at a party. The gap between the private reality of that experience and the public management of it was not something Harry articulated at the time. He was 16 and he was inside the machinery, and he did not yet have the language or the distance to describe what the machinery was doing. The language would come much later. The distance would take even longer and would require, in the end, leaving the country entirely. At Eton, Harry was not an exceptional academic student. He was not expected to be. The spare is not prepared for kingship the way the heir is prepared for kingship, and the preparation for a life as a senior royal of the second rank is a different kind of education. It involves learning to be useful at public events without overshadowing the person who matters more. It involves developing the social ease that makes patronages and charity work function. It involves, above all, learning to project the Windsor composure in situations where composure is the last thing one feels. Harry learned those things. He also developed, in parallel with that institutional education, a private personality that was increasingly different from the public one. The private Harry, according to friends who knew him in those years, was opinionated, emotional, sometimes explosive, and capable of a directness that the royal environment actively discouraged. He said what he thought, he felt what he felt, and was not reliably able to conceal it. These qualities made him exhausting for palace managers and enormously appealing to the people who actually spent time with him. When he left Eton in 2003, he had a gap year ahead of him and no very clear institutional plan for what came after. He went to Australia, where he worked on a cattle station in a way that was photographed and communicated to the public as character building. He went to Lesotho, where he worked with orphans affected by the AIDS crisis, and where something happened that was not staged for cameras and was not managed by anyone, which was that he genuinely connected with the children he met and was genuinely affected by what he saw. The Lesotho photographs, when they appeared, showed a different Harry from the one the tabloids had been constructing out of nightclub exits and party incidents. A young man sitting on the ground with children, not posed, not performing concern, but present in the way that people are present when they are actually in a moment rather than managing their image through it. Those photographs did something to public perception of Harry that no palace statement had managed. They made him look like a person. He enrolled at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in May 2005. The decision to join the army had been made some time before, and it was the first major life decision Harry had made that seemed to belong entirely to him rather than to the institutional script for what a spare prince does. The army appealed to him for reasons that, in retrospect, make considerable sense for a young man carrying the particular history he was carrying. The army has a clear structure and a clear purpose. It asks its members to function as part of something larger than themselves, without requiring them to manage a public image. The hierarchy is honest, in a way that royal hierarchy is not. When an officer outranks you in the army, the outranking is functional and acknowledged. When you are perpetually second in a royal family, the secondary status is real, but undiscussed, and the undiscussedness is its own particular weight. At Sandhurst, Harry excelled. His commanding officers and fellow officer cadets have described him consistently as someone who surprised people who expected a lightweight prince and found instead someone who worked hard, took the physical and tactical demands of the training seriously, and had a natural authority with the people under him. The army gave Harry the first institutional framework in his life that consistently treated him as capable. What the army could not give him, and did not try to give him, was anything approaching an emotional vocabulary for the grief he was still carrying. The army's relationship with emotional processing is, in some respects, structurally similar to the royal families. Composure is the currency. Forward motion is the instruction. You do not stop. You do not look back. You keep the surface intact, and you move toward the objective. Harry moved. The surface stayed intact. The grief stayed compressed. He was 20 years old in the autumn of 2004. He was a Sandhurst cadet who drank with his fellow cadets in the evenings and worked hard in the mornings, and had no serious relationship to speak of. He was still recognizable in tabloid photographs as the prince who turned up to nightclubs and wore impractical costumes to fancy dress parties, and occasionally said things to photographers that palace communications staff spent the following day managing. He was also, beneath all of that surface, someone who had lost his mother at 12, who had spent 8 years inside a family structure that did not discuss that loss, who had been taught by everything around him that what he felt privately was a matter to be managed rather than expressed, and who had arrived at adulthood carrying the weight of all of that without a reliable way to put it down. The person who met Chelsy Davy in Cape Town in that autumn was all of those things simultaneously: the prince, the cadet, the grieving son, the tabloid fixture, the young man with the warm laugh and the explosive directness, and the 8 years of compressed feeling. Chelsy Davy met all of those people at once. She was the first person in his adult life, by his own later account, who did not appear to want to manage any of them. That was either the simplest possible thing or the most complicated. In a life as managed as Harry's had been, it turned out to be both. The palace's reaction to Chelsy, when it came, was shaped by everything in that history, by the institutional approach to image that had governed Harry's life since before he understood what an image was, by the communications machinery that had been processing the family's private life into public narrative for decades, by the particular way that the Windsor institution looks at the women who come close to its princes and calculates not whether the prince is happy, but whether the woman represents risk. Chelsy represented risk in several directions the palace could clearly identify, and one direction it could not, which was that Harry, for the first time in his managed life, had found something that felt like his own. The institution's response to that feeling was to bury it. What the burial cost both of them, and what it built in Harry, that no one around him fully measured at the time, belongs to the years that followed. But the cost begins here, in the person who arrived at that relationship, the boy the palace had assembled out of grief and management and composure and duty, standing in Cape Town in the autumn of 2004, meeting a woman who laughed too freely and said too much, and was not going to follow any of the rules. He was, by every account of people who knew him then, immediately and entirely captivated. The palace would spend the next 2 years deciding what to do about that. The palace's first instinct when a woman enters a prince's life is assessment, not of the woman as a person, because the institution is not organized around that kind of consideration. Assessment of the woman as a variable. What does she come from? What does she bring? What does she represent in the public imagination, and what would she represent if that imagination were given access to her? Chelsy Yvonne Davy was born on the 13th of October, 1985, in Harare, Zimbabwe, to Charles Davy and Beverly Donald. Her father was one of the wealthiest men in Zimbabwe, a game farmer and businessman whose land holdings and commercial interests placed the Davy family in the category of Southern African wealth that the English upper classes occasionally acknowledged and more often quietly categorized as colonial rather than aristocratic, which in the institutional language of the palace was a distinction with consequences. Charles Davy's empire, at its height, covered game reserves in Zimbabwe and Zambia, cattle farming operations, and commercial interests across southern Africa. The family lived with the particular confidence of people who had built something large in an unstable part of the world and had decided, in the face of that instability, to remain. When Robert Mugabe's land reform program began taking farms from white landowners in Zimbabwe in the early 2000s, the Davy family watched a world they had grown up inside begin to dissolve. They adapted, the way wealthy families in unstable countries adapt, by moving capital and attention without fully uprooting. Charles Davy shifted more of his operations toward Zambia. The family maintained their position, but the years of the land reform program formed Chelsy's adolescence, and adolescences formed inside political instability produce a particular kind of person, one who does not assume that the ground beneath them is permanent. She was educated at Cheltenham College in England for a period, before completing her schooling at Arundel School in Harare. The English schooling gave her a fluency in the codes of the English upper middle class that she would later find both useful and entirely insufficient for the world she had accidentally entered. She arrived at the University of Cape Town in 2003 to study law, and it was there, in the particular social world of wealthy young people at a South African university, that she was when she met Harry. The people who knew Chelsy in Cape Town in those years describe her in consistent terms. She was direct. She was funny, and the humor was not the carefully managed variety that the palace environment produces in the people it trains, but the kind that arrives without checking the room first. She was athletic, comfortable outdoors, and indifferent to the social performance that English aristocratic women of her generation were expected to have mastered. She said what she thought. She held her own in arguments with people who expected her to defer. She had what one of her university friends, speaking to a journalist some years later, described as a quality of being entirely present in a conversation, in a way that made other people feel they were being actually listened to, rather than socially processed. She was, in other words, almost precisely the opposite of what the palace would have designed if it were designing a girlfriend for its spare prince. The institution's preference, in the matter of who its princes spend time with, had been relatively consistent across generations. The woman should come from a background that the English establishment recognizes without needing to research. She should have absorbed, through upbringing rather than instruction, the understanding of how to conduct herself in royal spaces. She should be comfortable at the kind of formal events that fill a royal calendar without requiring management. She should not, under any circumstances, have opinions about the institution itself, or about the men who run it, or about the machinery that will immediately begin processing her as a communications variable the moment she enters a prince's life. Chelsy Davy had opinions about everything. She had grown up in a household where her father was the kind of man who built large things in difficult places and did not spend considerable time softening his assessments of the world. The Davy household was not a training ground for the particular form of careful self-presentation that the palace valued in the women around its princes. It was a household where people said what they meant and expected others to do the same. Chelsy had absorbed that entirely. What the palace saw when it looked at Chelsy Davy was a checklist of complications. She was not British, which the institution could have managed, had managed before, and which was not in itself disqualifying. But she was not European aristocracy either, which was the other category the palace understood. She was the daughter of a Zimbabwean businessman whose wealth had come from land and game farming in a country where the political situation around white-owned land had been, in recent years, internationally reported in ways that were not entirely comfortable. The tabloids, which were always several moves ahead of the palace in identifying attack surfaces, would eventually find Charles Davy's business interests and begin describing them in terms designed to cause maximum discomfort. She was studying law in South Africa. She had no intention, as far as anyone could determine, of relocating to England to become the kind of permanently available companion that a senior royal's girlfriend is functionally required to be. She had her own life, her own trajectory, and her own understanding of what she wanted from the years ahead. And what she wanted did not appear to include subordinating herself to an institution's communications strategy. She was also, and this was perhaps the central difficulty from the palace's perspective, entirely unwilling to pretend. The pretending is not optional in a royal relationship. It is the price of entry. You pretend, in public, that the cameras do not bother you. You pretend that the briefings about your dress and your manner and your public presentation are helpful suggestions from people who know better, rather than instructions from an institution that has decided to treat you as a variable in its image management. You pretend that the constant assessment of your suitability by people you have never met, published in newspapers you did not ask to be written about you, is simply the cost of being with someone you love and therefore acceptable. You pretend that the life you had before, the friends and the freedom and the ability to exist in public without someone photographing you from a parked car, was a reasonable price to pay for something that the institution will remind you, at every available opportunity, that you are lucky to have. Chelsy was not going to pretend any of those things. The palace could see that from a considerable distance. What they could not see, or chose not to examine, was what this particular quality meant to Harry. He had spent his entire life surrounded by pretending. He had watched his mother pretend, and then stop pretending, and then die with the machinery still running. He had watched his father manage, and his grandmother maintain, and the entire apparatus around him perform, across his entire childhood, the sustained production of a public face that bore a carefully managed relationship to whatever was actually happening. Chelsy did not perform, she existed. That was not a small thing to a 20-year-old who had been performing since he could walk. The early months of the relationship happened in Cape Town, in the specific social world of wealthy young people in southern Africa, which operates at a distance from British tabloid surveillance that was, in 2004, still considerable. Harry was at Sandhurst, with the particular restrictions that military training imposes on a cadet's freedom of movement, and the particular freedom it provides in terms of institutional supervision. When he travelled to South Africa on leave, he was travelling as a military cadet rather than as a working royal, and the communications machinery around him was proportionally less intensive. He and Chelsy moved through Cape Town in a social group large enough to provide cover. They were not photographed together in any way that reached the British press in those early months. The relationship existed, for a brief and probably precious period, outside the institutional awareness that would later attempt to define it. Harry has described, in various contexts over the years, what those early months felt like. The descriptions are consistent enough that they form a coherent picture. He was happy in a way he had not been before in his adult life. Not the managed happiness of public events successfully navigated, nor the performative happiness of nightclub photographs, but something private and his own that did not require an audience or a communications sign-off. Chelsy, according to people who knew her in Cape Town, was characteristically direct about the relationship. She was with Harry. She liked him enormously. She was also clear-eyed, in the way that people raised in southern Africa, rather than in English drawing rooms sometimes are, about the complications that came attached to him. She had not sought those complications. She had found a person she wanted to spend time with, and was discovering, at an accelerating pace, that the person came with an institution attached. The institution was not yet fully aware of her. When it became aware, the awareness arrived in the particular form that palace awareness of a prince's girlfriend always arrives in, as a management problem requiring a management strategy. The strategy that emerged in the case of Chelsy Davy was suppression. The word requires some unpacking, because the suppression was not dramatic and was not cruel in any way that announced itself as cruelty. It was institutional, and therefore came wrapped in the vocabulary of consideration. There were concerns, expressed by people whose job it was to express concerns, about the timing of public disclosure. Harry was a Sandhurst cadet. He was not yet a working royal in the full sense. His public profile was, at that moment, in a manageable position, after several years of tabloid difficulty, and a relationship announced at the wrong moment could complicate the progress that had been made. There were questions about the level of media attention a public disclosure would generate, and whether that level of attention was in Harry's interests. There were thoughts about whether Chelsy was prepared for that attention, and whether her preparation was the palace's responsibility. These concerns were all, in their individual elements, coherent. Taken together, they added up to a decision that someone who was 20 years old and in love with a young woman who happened to be the daughter of a Zimbabwean game farmer was better served by keeping her invisible. The decision was not presented to Harry as a decision. That is not how the palace communicates. It was presented as guidance, as the accumulated wisdom of people who had managed these situations before and understood the consequences of mismanaging them. Harry was 20. He had spent his life inside an institution that communicated by implication and governed by the steady pressure of expectation. He accepted the guidance in the way he had always accepted the guidance, not because he agreed with it, but because disagreeing required a kind of institutional confidence he had not yet developed. Chelsy accepted it less easily. She was not inside the institution. She had not grown up learning to read its signals or absorb its pressure as though it were weather. When she was told, by the communications apparatus around Harry, that the relationship was better managed privately for the time being, she heard what the palace intended as protective advice and understood it as something else. She understood it as the institution looking at her and finding her insufficient. She was not wrong. The palace's management of her invisibility was not, at its root, about timing. It was about assessment. The institution had looked at Chelsy Davy and found a list of characteristics that did not match the template it had developed, across generations, for the women beside its princes. She was not English. Her family's background in Zimbabwe invited the kind of press attention that the tabloids gave to stories involving wealthy white landowners in southern Africa. She was studying abroad with no clear plan to return to Britain permanently. She had an independence of character that suggested she would not subordinate herself willingly to the institutional machinery. She made Harry happy in a way that was visible and private, which meant it was beyond the institution's control. The institution's response to things beyond its control is to bring them within its control or to make them invisible. Chelsy could not easily be brought within control. She was therefore managed toward invisibility. This management took specific forms. The newspapers that operated within the understood relationship with Kensington Palace, a relationship built on access and briefings, and the occasional exclusive that required reciprocal compliance, were made aware that the palace had sensitivities in the area of Harry's private life. The understanding did not need to be made explicit. That is the sophistication of the system. A newspaper that maintains a functional relationship with a royal communications office has a financial interest in preserving that relationship. A story that irritates the communications office costs the newspaper something. The cost is not stated. It does not need to be. There were also more direct forms of pressure. Photographers who turned up in locations where Harry and Chelsy were spending time were made aware that their presence was noted. Sources within Harry's circle who might have spoken to tabloid journalists were reminded, in the vocabulary of loyalty and discretion, that the palace has always deployed effectively, that speaking was not in anyone's interests. What the palace could not suppress was the story's eventual emergence. These stories always emerge. The British press has, across centuries of practice, developed a near-perfect instinct for the moment when a royal secret can be printed without sufficient institutional consequence to make printing it costly. The moment arrives when the relationship has developed to a point where denying it becomes more embarrassing than acknowledging it, when enough people know that the knowledge itself becomes the story, when the palace's silence on a particular subject starts to read, to experienced royal correspondence, as confirmation rather than absence. In the case of Chelsy Davy, that moment arrived in late 2004 and early 2005, when enough people in enough social circles had seen Harry with Chelsy in enough different contexts that the relationship's existence was no longer a secret in any meaningful sense. It was simply a secret that had not been printed. Before it was printed, the palace had one final opportunity to manage the narrative. They did not take it in the form of an announcement. The palace rarely announces. It briefed. Selected journalists received information that allowed them to print the story in a frame that the palace preferred, which was the frame of a young prince enjoying a holiday romance that should not be read as anything more serious than that. The holiday romance framing was chosen carefully. It communicated that the relationship existed. It communicated that the relationship was not serious. It placed Chelsy in the category of a pleasant interlude in a young man's life, rather than in the category of a person of significance. It did all of this without requiring the palace to say anything that could be quoted or attributed or later challenged. Chelsy, when she became aware of the frame in which she was being presented to the British public, had a reaction that was entirely consistent with her character. She was furious. She had not agreed to be a holiday romance. She was in a serious relationship with a person she cared about and who cared about her, and the institution attached to that person had decided, without consulting her, that the public presentation of that relationship would minimize her. She communicated her reaction to Harry in direct language. Harry, caught between the institution's management of the situation and a girlfriend who was not going to accept institutional management gracefully, found himself in the position that would become, across the next several years, the defining tension of his adult life, the space between what the people around him required and what the person he was with deserved. He handled it badly, in the way that 20-year-olds handle impossible situations. He tried to manage Chelsy's reaction the way he had been taught to manage his own reactions, by explaining that this was how things worked, and that the patience required now would produce a different situation later. Chelsy did not find this convincing. She had not been raised inside the institution. She did not find its logic natural. She found it controlling, which it was, and she said so, which the institution around Harry found alarming, and the communications staff filed as evidence that their assessment of her as a complication had been correct. The filing was self-fulfilling in the way that institutional assessments usually are. The palace had decided that Chelsy was a complication. Her reaction to being managed as a complication confirmed, in the institutional record, that she was a complication. The confirmation justified further management. The management generated further resistance. The cycle had no internal mechanism for stopping itself, because the institution was not organized to question its own assessments, and the person who might have pushed back, who might have said to the communications apparatus that it was mishandling someone important to him, had not yet developed the confidence or the language to do so. Harry, at 20, was not yet able to advocate for Chelsy against the palace. He was barely able to advocate for himself. The capacity to do that would come, but it would come later, and it would come at a cost that neither he nor anyone around him had fully calculated. What Chelsy represented to Harry, in the period when the palace was working hardest to manage her into invisibility, was specific and irreplaceable. She was the person outside the institution. She existed in a life that the machinery had not designed and did not control, and when he was with her, he existed in that life too. The relief of that was not something he could articulate to the people around him, because articulating it would have required explaining that the life the palace had built for him felt, at 20 years old, like a performance he was exhausted by, and that the performance had been running since he was old enough to be photographed. He could not say that yet. It would take another 18 years, a marriage, 2 children, a move to California, and a memoir that his family reportedly found devastating before he could say it publicly. But it was present in him at 20, sitting in Cape Town with Chelsy Davy, in the brief window before the palace's management apparatus reached them. The window was closing. The press would break the story before the end of 2004. The communications staff would scramble to control the framing. The holiday romance briefing would go out. Chelsy would become, for the British public, the name attached to Harry's latest development, assessed in the way that royal girlfriends are always assessed, by class, by background, by the question of whether she looked like someone who could eventually stand on a balcony and wave in the right direction. She did not look like that person, in the palace's estimation, and the palace's estimation was the one that mattered in the room without the floor plan. What the palace could not factor into its estimation, because institutions are not built to factor in things of this kind, was what Chelsy's presence had already built in Harry in the months before the management apparatus arrived. She had shown him, for the first time since his mother died, that a person could be with him without managing him. She had laughed with him without checking whether the laughter was appropriate. She had argued with him without softening the argument to protect his feelings or his position. She had been angry with the institution on his behalf before he had worked out how to be angry on his own behalf. She had, in short, treated him as a person rather than as a position. The institution, looking at all of this, saw complication. What it had actually produced, by deciding immediately and instinctively to manage her toward invisibility, was education. Harry was learning, through the experience of watching the palace handle Chelsy, something about the palace that no one inside it would have chosen to teach him. He was learning what it did to the people he loved when those people did not fit the template. That lesson would take years to fully settle in him. It would be reinforced and reinforced again across the years that followed, across other relationships and other management strategies and other women who did not fit the template and were handled accordingly. The lesson would accumulate until it became something he could act on. He could not act on it at 20. He was a Sandhurst cadet in love with a woman from Zimbabwe who was furious at an institution that had decided she was a holiday romance, and the most he could do was stand between them and try to keep both intact. The palace had the better resources for that kind of standoff. It had those resources by considerable measure. It also had, on its side, the deeply conditioned compliance of a young man who had spent his entire life being told that the institution's requirements were not negotiable. What it did not fully account for was that Chelsy Davy was also not negotiable. The 2 years that followed were not the suppression of a holiday romance. They were the suppression of a relationship that both people involved took entirely seriously, conducted partly in public and partly in secret, managed by an institution that had decided the secret was safer than the disclosure, and shaped, in ways that would not become fully visible for years, by the gulf between what Harry felt and what the machinery around him permitted him to show. The burial lasted longer than either of them could have anticipated. It lasted long enough to damage them both in specific and different ways. It lasted long enough that when it finally ended, when the story became unburyable and the press printed it in a form the palace could not control, the relationship that emerged into public view was already a different thing from the relationship that had begun in Cape Town in the autumn of 2004. It was older, it was more pressured, it carried, by the time the world saw it, the weight of 2 years of being managed as an embarrassment by people who had never once sat with either of them and asked what they actually needed. The institution never did ask that question. In its estimation, that question was not part of the job. The British press and the British royal family have maintained, across the better part of a century, a relationship that neither side has ever been comfortable describing honestly in public. It is not an agreement in any legal sense. Nothing is written down. No contract exists that any lawyer could produce in a courtroom. What exists instead is a mutual understanding, refined across generations of royal correspondence and palace communications staff, about the terms on which information moves between the institution and the newspapers that cover it. Those terms are simple at their core, even when their operation is complex. The palace provides access. The palace provides briefings, exclusives, the occasional carefully managed photograph, the private background conversation with a senior communications official that gives a royal correspondent the ability to write a story with authority. In return, the newspaper maintains a functional relationship with the palace that it has a financial interest in not destroying. The relationship is preserved by discretion on both sides. The palace does not brief against newspapers that cooperate. Newspapers that cooperate receive things that newspapers outside the relationship do not receive. The system has a great many consequences, most of them invisible to the people who read the resulting coverage. One consequence that was not at all invisible to anyone inside it was the system's utility as a suppression mechanism. A palace that wanted a story not printed did not need to threaten anyone. It needed only to make clear, through the existing channels, that it had sensitivities in a particular area, and that the management of those sensitivities would be noted in the distribution of future access. This was the mechanism deployed in the case of Chelsy Davy in the months between the autumn of 2004 and the point, somewhere in early 2005, when the story became unsuppressible. The mechanism worked through several parallel channels simultaneously, which was both its strength and its eventual weakness. When multiple channels are operating in the same direction, the suppression is more complete. When the story reaches the critical mass at which enough people know it, that the knowledge itself becomes the story, the multiple channels have no coordinated way to respond, because they were never designed for coordination. They were designed for containment, and containment is a strategy that functions until it fails completely. The first channel was the straightforward management of photographer access. Harry's movements during the period of his Sandhurst training were partially covered by the military's own protocols around the privacy of officer cadets in training. The palace exploited this coverage intelligently. When Harry travelled, the travel was managed with the attention to logistical detail that the royal communications apparatus applies to any senior principal's movements. Which airports, which routes, which points of arrival and departure were accessible to press photographers, and which were not, involved decisions that could be shaped by the cooperation or non-cooperation of the people managing the travel. When Harry was in South Africa, he was outside British jurisdiction and outside the British press's normal operational range. The Cape Town social world of 2004 and 2005 was photographed regularly by local media, but the mechanism by which those photographs reached the British tabloids was slower and less reliable than the domestic operation. There was a window, in those early months, during which the relationship existed in photographs that had been taken but not transmitted, seen by people who were present but not yet connected to the channels through which they would have reached Fleet Street. The palace used that window by not closing it actively, but by not opening it either. There was no proactive effort to bring the story into the light on terms the palace controlled, which is the other option an institution faces when managing a secret that is already partially known. The palace chose silence over management, which communicated, to the people inside the communications apparatus, that the preference was for the story not to be told at all. The second channel was the briefing network. Royal correspondents at the major British newspapers maintain relationships with palace communications staff that are managed with care on both sides. Those relationships involve regular contact, background conversations, and the kind of accumulated mutual understanding that develops between people who have been working within the same closed system for years. When a palace communications official mentions, in a background conversation with a royal correspondent, that a particular area is sensitive, the correspondent understands that the sensitivity means something. The mention does not say, "Do not print this." It does not need to. What it says, in the vocabulary of the relationship, is that printing it will cost you something, and the correspondent can calculate whether what they gain from printing it is worth what they lose. In the case of Chelsy Davy, the palace's communication through the briefing network was not aggressive. It did not need to be aggressive to be effective. The message was simply that Harry's private life was something the palace was managing carefully, and that premature disclosure would not be welcomed. The correspondents who received this communication understood its implications. Several of them had information about the relationship that they chose, in the months that followed, not to act on. This restraint was not altruistic. It was rational. The correspondents who held back were calculating that the access relationship was worth more, in the medium term, than the immediate story. They were right about this in the narrow commercial sense. They were also participating, without most of them thinking of it in these terms, in the burial of a young woman's existence in her own relationship. Chelsy knew none of this was happening in any specific or detailed sense. She knew the relationship was being kept quiet. She knew that when she and Harry appeared in the same locations in Cape Town, the British press was not reporting it. She could observe the absence of coverage without knowing its mechanism. What she could not observe was the network of informal agreements and understood sensitivities and careful background conversations that were producing the absence. Harry knew more than she did, because he was inside the institution and she was not, but he did not know the full mechanism either. He knew that the palace had preferences about the timing of disclosure. He knew that the communications staff had expressed those preferences to him in the language of advice and guidance. He did not know, in the detailed operational sense, exactly which calls were being made to which editors, or exactly what was being communicated in which briefings. The institution does not share its operational details with the principals whose interests it manages. This is partly because the principals might object to some of those operational details if they knew them, and partly because the institution has a general preference for operating at a level of abstraction that keeps its methods somewhat obscured even from the people it serves. What Harry understood was the outcome. The relationship was not in the papers. The relationship being not in the papers meant that Chelsy was not being subjected, yet, to the specific form of assault that the British tabloids deploy against women who enter royal orbits. It meant that the photographs of Chelsy in Cape Town were not accompanied by articles speculating about her background and her family's wealth and her father's business interests and whether she was suitable material for a prince. It meant that she could still, in the limited contexts available to her, move through the world without being photographed from parked cars. He could construct a version of the palace's management, from this outcome, as protective. He had watched what the tabloids had done to his mother. He had watched what they had done to women who entered the royal orbit without adequate preparation. He had some understanding of what the press attention that would follow public disclosure would feel like for a woman who had never sought public attention and had not developed either the emotional armoring or the communications infrastructure to manage it. The silence, from this angle, looked like it was protecting Chelsy. He understood, in a part of himself that was less willing to be comforted by institutional logic, that the silence was not protecting Chelsy. It was protecting the institution's preference for managing the situation at a pace and in a manner that suited the institution's interests. Chelsy's well-being was incidental to that preference. If the silence happened to protect her as well, this was not its purpose. Its purpose was control. He could not fully articulate this in 2004 and 2005. He was 20 and 21 years old. He had been inside the institution's management of his life since birth. The institution's logic had the particular power of familiarity, of having always been the operating environment, so that questioning it required questioning everything, including his own trained responses to it. He did not question it all at once. That is not how people inside powerful institutions learn to question them. The questioning comes in specific moments, triggered by specific experiences, accumulating over time into something large enough to act on. In 2004 and 2005, the moments were beginning. They were not yet sufficient. At Sandhurst, Harry's life had a structure that made the management of the relationship with Chelsy practically easier than it would otherwise have been. A military cadet's days are governed by training schedules and institutional requirements that limit the time available for personal life. This meant that the contact between Harry and Chelsy happened in compressed windows, during leave, during travel, and increasingly over telephone and early forms of digital communication that were less traceable than the physical proximity that tabloid photographers relied on. The compression of contact had consequences for the relationship that neither of them fully anticipated. A relationship that exists in concentrated bursts, separated by long periods of distance and institutional management, develops differently from one that has space and continuity. The concentrated bursts are intense. The separations are longer than the intensity can comfortably sustain. The distance becomes a container for the anxiety that the relationship generates, the anxiety of knowing that the management apparatus is present and active, that the public disclosure could arrive at any time in a form neither of them controlled, that the institution's patience with the situation was temporary and its ultimate intentions were unclear. Chelsy handled the distance with the particular independence of character that had made her interesting to Harry in the first place. She continued her law degree at Cape Town. She maintained her social world, her friendships, her own life. She did not suspend herself in a holding pattern, waiting for the palace to decide what it thought of her. But the awareness of the management was always present, and the awareness had a quality that Chelsy, in the years since, has described in terms that are consistent across interviews, a sense of being simultaneously significant enough to be managed and insufficient enough to be hidden. That combination is a specific kind of diminishment. The palace's management of the suppression was not designed to be cruel to Chelsy as a person, but its effect on her, experienced from the inside, was the effect of being told by a powerful institution that her relationship was real enough to be worth controlling and not real enough to be worth acknowledging. These two messages, delivered simultaneously by the same apparatus, do not reconcile. Living inside their irreconcilability is corrosive in ways that palace communications staff do not spend considerable time considering. The third channel of suppression, and in some ways the most effective, was the management of Harry's public schedule and public image during the period. Kensington Palace understood, from long institutional experience, that the best way to manage a story that cannot be told is to give the press something else to cover. Harry's public engagements during his Sandhurst period were managed with attention to the narrative they produced. He was photographed on training exercises. He was seen at official events in his cadet uniform. He was presented, through the careful calibration of access that the palace controls, as a young man focused on his military career and his public duties. This presentation was not entirely false. Harry was focused on his military training. He was working hard at Sandhurst. He was performing well. The picture the palace was presenting to the press had enough truth in it to be sustainable, which is always the requirement for successful institutional narrative management. The presentation did not lie outright. It selected. It showed the parts of Harry's life that the institution was comfortable with, and withheld the parts it was not. What it withheld was the part that was most real to him. The selection had a quality that people inside palace communications operations would describe as narrative shaping. It is a more honest description to say it was a sustained construction of a false impression of a person's life. The person most constructed against was not the public, who were simply receiving the impression the palace had shaped. The person most constructed against was Harry himself, who was being required to participate in the construction of an impression that excised the most important relationship in his adult life. He is not the first member of the royal family to have experienced this. The history of the Windsor family contains a considerable number of people who spent years participating in official presentations of themselves that bore a managed relationship to their actual experience. The managed relationship between the official and the actual is so deep in the institutional culture that it is not experienced by most of its participants as dishonesty. It is experienced as the way things are, as the price of the position, as the necessary distance between the public role and the private person that everyone inside the institution accepts as foundational. Harry was accepting it. He was 21 years old and he was accepting it because he had no framework for not accepting it. The framework would come, but it would be built from experiences like this one, accumulated over years. The period at Sandhurst ended in April 2006, when Harry was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Blues and Royals Regiment of the Household Cavalry. The commissioning parade at Sandhurst was a public event, photographed and covered by the press in the approved manner. Charles was present. William was present. The family gathered in the approved formation for the approved photographs. There was no Chelsy in any of the photographs, because Chelsy was not part of the approved presentation. She was in the crowd. The photographs that were not taken were the photographs that mattered. In the months between Harry's commissioning and the eventual public emergence of the relationship in late 2005 and early 2006, the suppression faced increasing structural pressure. The mechanism that had worked in the early period was showing the strain that all suppression mechanisms show when the secret they are containing grows larger than the container. By early 2005, the relationship had been running for approximately 6 months and had acquired the solidity that 6 months of sustained emotional investment gives a relationship between people who are serious about each other. It was no longer susceptible to the holiday romance framing. It had moved past the point where the principals themselves could participate in the minimizing of its significance. More practically, it had been seen by enough people in enough different contexts that the social network it existed within had expanded beyond the palace's ability to manage it comprehensively. The palace's briefing network operated most effectively with the professional press, with royal correspondents who were inside the understood relationship and had reasons to maintain it. It operated less effectively with the wider circle of people who had seen Harry and Chelsy together in Cape Town and at social events in England, who were not royal correspondents, who had no professional relationship with the palace to maintain, and who spoke to friends, who spoke to people, who eventually spoke to journalists operating outside the royal correspondent network. The tabloid ecosystem in Britain is not monolithic. It contains the royal correspondents with their institutional relationships and their access calculations, and it also contains reporters and freelance photographers who operate entirely outside those relationships, who have nothing to maintain with the palace, and therefore nothing to lose by printing what they find. These people had been present at several events where Harry and Chelsy were together. Their photographs existed. The question of when to print them was a question of when the commercial value of printing exceeded whatever informal obstacle the palace's management had placed in the way. By the end of 2005, the commercial calculation had shifted decisively. The relationship had been running for over a year. The people inside Harry's social circle, who had not spoken to journalists, were being outnumbered by the photographs and the accumulated social knowledge of enough people in enough different locations that the story was, in the press's estimation, now confirmable, without requiring the cooperation of anyone with an institutional relationship to protect. The palace's communications staff understood the pressure on the container. The options at this point were limited in the way that suppression options are always limited when the suppression is failing. They could allow the story to break uncontrolled, in a form the palace did not shape. They could attempt to shape the break by briefing a selected outlet with a version of the story they preferred, accepting the disclosure but controlling the frame. They could attempt to extend the suppression while the story broke around them, which would produce the worst possible outcome. The story printed in a context that also described the palace's attempts to suppress it. The palace chose, as it typically does in these situations, a version of controlled disclosure. Selected royal correspondents were given information that allowed the story to be published in a register that the palace preferred. The register was the register of the managed reveal, a young prince, a serious relationship, a young woman who was getting to know the royal family and was doing so in the appropriate way, privately and carefully. The framing was not the holiday romance frame of the earlier briefings. The relationship had grown too visible for that frame to survive contact with the actual story. The new frame was the serious relationship, assessed with appropriate seriousness, moving at a pace that reflected the prince's maturity and the sensitivity of his position. Chelsy was not consulted on the frame. The first significant British press coverage of the relationship appeared in November 2004, in a form that was substantially shaped by the palace's preferred register. It identified Chelsy by name and background. It described the relationship as serious. It described Chelsy in terms that reflected the palace's framing choices. She was assessed in relation to Harry, presented in the context of what she might mean for his future, evaluated against the implicit requirements of the position she was adjacent to. She was presented as a possibility. Whether she was a suitable possibility was left, as it always is in royal coverage of this kind, to the reader's assessment against criteria the reader had absorbed from years of following royal relationships. She was also, in much of the coverage that followed in the months after the first disclosure, described in terms of her background that she found deeply offensive. Her father's business interests, her Zimbabwean origins, the land reform context that surrounded any discussion of white land ownership in Zimbabwe in that period. These were all deployed with the casual comprehensiveness of a press operation that had identified a line of inquiry and intended to follow it fully. The coverage was not sympathetic. It was not designed to be sympathetic. It was designed to be interesting, and Chelsy Davy's background was interesting in the ways that the tabloid press finds things interesting, because it contained complications that could be described in terms that made readers feel something. Harry watched this coverage with a reaction that has been described by people close to him in those years as a mixture of guilt, anger, and helplessness in roughly equal parts. The guilt came from knowing that his presence in her life had produced the coverage. The anger came from watching the coverage and knowing that it bore almost no relationship to the person he was with. The helplessness came from knowing that the machinery producing the coverage was the same machinery that governed his life, and that he had no effective means of confronting it. He had one option that people in his situation almost never take. He could speak publicly. He could give the kind of interview that sets a record straight, describes a relationship in the person's own terms, asserts the reality against the coverage. He did not take this option because taking it would have been a direct confrontation with the palace's management of his public image, and he was 21 years old, and the confrontation was not yet something he was capable of. The palace's communications staff would have discouraged the option strongly had he raised it, which he probably did not. The communication between Harry and the palace on this subject happened in the indirect vocabulary that governed all of the institution's internal communications. His unhappiness with the coverage was understood. It was noted as a factor in future management decisions. It was not treated as a legitimate objection that altered the institution's approach. Chelsy, meanwhile, was undergoing the specific transformation that the British tabloid experience produces in private people who have not chosen to be public. The coverage did not make her public in the sense of giving her a public persona she had any role in constructing. It made her public in the sense of extracting the publicly available facts about her, constructing from those facts a character that suited the coverage, and deploying that character in stories she had not authorized, about a relationship she had not asked to have written about. She continued her degree in Cape Town, in the specific position of being simultaneously in a significant relationship with a British prince and entirely outside the systems, the advisors, the institutional infrastructure, and the prepared communications machinery that would have helped her manage the public aspects of that position. She was navigating coverage of herself with no professional support and no experience of being covered. She had opinions about the coverage that she expressed in the direct language that was her natural register, and the expressing of those opinions in private contexts occasionally produced additional material for the coverage. The palace's communications staff observed this pattern and did not offer help. Chelsy was not their principal. She was adjacent to their principal. The offer of institutional support for an adjacent person would have implied a level of seriousness about the relationship that the palace had not yet decided to communicate. The institutional support was therefore withheld, which meant that Chelsy faced coverage of herself without the resources that the most powerful communications apparatus in Britain could have provided, and which was providing, every day, for the person she was with. This is the specific form of the burial that gets lost in the narrative of suppression. The suppression was not only about keeping the relationship out of the papers in the early months, it was also about the decision, once the relationship was in the papers, not to extend to Chelsy the institutional resources that would have helped her survive the coverage. She was disclosed when disclosure became unavoidable, and then she was left to manage the consequences of disclosure without support. The 2 years between the beginning of the relationship and its full public acknowledgement were 2 years in which the palace's interests and Chelsy's interests diverged at almost every point, and in which the divergence was managed entirely in favor of the palace's interests. Harry was in the middle of this divergence, partly understanding it and partly not, loving someone who was being managed as a variable in an equation she had not agreed to be part of. The suppression left specific marks on the relationship that would not be visible until the relationship entered its public phase, and the marks showed in the way a fracture in structural material shows under load. The relationship had been built in circumstances of concealment, across distance, under institutional pressure, with both people aware that what they felt privately was being managed against by a system that had not acknowledged it as real. That is not the right environment in which to build something durable. The palace had not considered this, because the palace's assessment of the relationship had never been about the relationship. It had been about the communications calculation. The human cost of the calculation was not a factor in the calculation. It is not that the people making the calculation were indifferent to human cost in general. It is that institutional calculations of this kind are not set up to measure human cost. They are set up to measure risk and manage image and protect the principal's public position. Harry was the principal. His position was managed. His private life was managed with the same efficiency applied to everything else, which meant it was managed in the institution's interests and not in his own, and the distinction between those two interests was something he was only beginning to understand at 21. Chelsy understood it clearly. She had arrived at that understanding without the benefit of the 20 years of institutional conditioning that had prevented Harry from reaching it earlier. She understood it because she was outside the institution and could see it from the outside, and from the outside it did not look like protection and management and careful stewardship of a young man's well-being. It looked like a system that had decided her relationship was an embarrassment and had spent 2 years treating it accordingly. She was right. The institution would not have put it in those terms, but in the terms it would have used: communications challenge requiring careful management, sensitivity requiring appropriate discretion, relationship that would benefit from being brought forward at the right moment. In all of those institutional phrasings, the underlying assessment was identical to the one Chelsy had formed in plain language from the outside. The relationship was not what the palace wanted it to be. The management apparatus had spent 2 years attempting to make it into something more manageable. The attempt had not succeeded because the people inside the relationship had continued to treat it as what it was, which was a serious relationship between two people who cared about each other in ways that the institutional calculation had not made space for. When the coverage finally arrived in full, when the story ran in the forms the palace had not controlled, and alongside the forms it had partially shaped, the relationship that emerged into public view was carrying everything those 2 years had built inside it. The love was real, the damage was also real. The two things had existed in the relationship simultaneously for so long that neither Harry nor Chelsy could yet fully separate them. They would spend several more years trying. The story broke in the way that suppressed royal stories always break, not in a single moment, but in a series of escalating incursions, each one testing the perimeter of what the palace could still manage, until the perimeter gave way entirely, and the management became retrospective damage control rather than actual prevention. The first incursions were the photographs. Not the formal photographs taken at official events, which the palace controlled with the precision of a decades-old production operation, but the informal ones, taken by freelance photographers operating outside the royal correspondent network, who had no access relationship to protect and no institutional memory of consequences for printing what they found. These photographers had been present at social events in England and South Africa, where Harry and Chelsy appeared together. The photographs existed in their archives before the palace was fully aware they had been taken. The photographs that reached the press in late 2004 and into 2005 did not arrive as a coherent narrative that any single outlet had assembled. They arrived piecemeal, in different publications, at different moments, each one advancing the public's knowledge of the relationship by a small increment. A photograph of two people at a social event in London who appeared to be together. A photograph in Cape Town that placed them in the same location. A source who had seen them at a party and was speaking to a journalist on the understanding that the information would be used carefully. The palace's response to each incursion was calibrated by what the incursion cost them in narrative control and what the available responses could recover. For the earliest photographs, the response was silence, which in institutional communications is not the same as doing nothing. Silence, when maintained by a palace communications operation with the resources and the relationships that Kensington Palace commanded, communicates something specific to the press ecosystem. It communicates that the palace is aware of the story, that it is assessing its response, and that outlets proceeding without the palace's guidance are proceeding without the benefits that guidance normally provides. Some outlets took the communication in the direction the palace intended. Others did not. The News of the World was among the outlets that did not. It is worth pausing on this, because the relationship between the News of the World and the royal family in the period from approximately 2002 to 2011 was not what it publicly appeared to be. It appeared to be the familiar adversarial relationship between an aggressive tabloid and an institution trying to protect the privacy of its members. The reality, which emerged in the Leveson inquiry and in the subsequent criminal proceedings against News of the World journalists and executives, was considerably more complicated. The News of the World was, during this period, hacking telephones. The practice had begun as a targeted investigative technique and had expanded, under the editorial regime of Rebecca Brooks and then Andy Coulson, into something closer to an operational infrastructure for story gathering. The phones of public figures, celebrities, politicians, and members of the royal family's wider circle were accessed without their knowledge or consent. The voicemails of those public figures were listened to by journalists, who then used the information to inform stories, to identify sources, and to know things that no legitimate journalism could have produced. Harry's phone was hacked. Chelsy's phone was hacked. This is not speculation or inference. It is established as fact through the legal proceedings that followed the Leveson inquiry, through the civil litigation that Harry and others brought against News Group newspapers, and through Harry's own testimony and public statements. The hacking of his and Chelsy's communications meant that some of what the News of the World published about the relationship in this period was not derived from the institutional network of royal correspondents and their managed access. It was derived from private communications between two people who believed they were speaking in private. The specific content of those communications, what was said in hacked voicemails between Harry and Chelsy during the period of the palace's suppression, has not been fully disclosed publicly. Harry has indicated, across his memoir and his testimony in legal proceedings, that the knowledge that private conversations had been listened to was not something he could fully absorb at once. The recognition that the most intimate communications of his relationship had been available to journalists working at a national newspaper, that people in an editorial office had listened to messages between him and the woman he loved during the period when that love was being managed as an institutional embarrassment, produced in him a reaction that he has described as a combination of violation and fury. The fury had been building for some time before the phone hacking became fully known to him. The coverage of Chelsy in the period after the relationship's public emergence was coverage that required no hacking to be offensive. It required only the tabloid press's established approach to women who enter royal orbits from outside the expected categories of acceptability, which is to assess them publicly against standards they did not agree to be assessed against, in terms that carry the particular cruelty of being presented as neutral observation. The coverage of Chelsy in 2005 and 2006 drew repeatedly on her background in southern Africa. The references to her father's business interests and land holdings were made in a context that relied on the reader's awareness of the land reform situation in Zimbabwe without ever fully explaining that context, which meant the references functioned as implications rather than statements, implying proximity to controversy while maintaining the technical claim of factual reporting. Her appearance was assessed in the language that tabloid coverage of women in public life uses, which is the language of comparative evaluation against an implied standard of what a woman in this position should look like. Her nationality, her education, her accent, her manner of dress, her social life, her friendships, all of these were material for coverage that presented itself as information but functioned as assessment. The assessment was consistently organized around the same implicit question: was she suitable? Not suitable for Harry as a person, which was not a question the tabloid press has ever treated as within its appropriate scope, but suitable as a proposition for the institution, suitable as a potential future royal, suitable in the category of women who stand beside princes at official engagements and gradually become part of the official furniture. She was found, consistently, to be a question mark. This was partly because she genuinely did not fit the established template, and partly because finding her a question mark was commercially productive, since it kept the story running in a state of unresolved assessment that readers could follow across editions. Chelsy's response to this coverage was to withdraw from it to the extent that withdrawal was possible. She did not give interviews, she did not participate in the mechanism of photo opportunities, and carefully managed public appearances through which royal girlfriends who play the game correctly signal their compliance and receive, in return, a marginally more sympathetic treatment from the press that is watching them. She continued her degree in Cape Town. She saw Harry when he could travel, and when she could travel. She moved through her own life with the particular determination of someone who has decided that the alternative to continuing is not acceptable. The withdrawal was not, from the palace's perspective, cooperative behavior. The palace understood, from long experience with the mechanics of tabloid coverage, that the most effective way to manage the press's assessment of a figure adjacent to the royal family was to provide that press with material that could be used to construct a preferred narrative. Chelsy's refusal to cooperate with the construction of any narrative, preferred or otherwise, left the press to construct one from the available material, which was her father's business interests, and the Zimbabwe context, and the photographs taken without her consent, and the hacked voicemails she did not know were being listened to. The narrative the press constructed was not kind. The palace watched it being constructed and did not intervene in Chelsy's favor, because intervening in Chelsy's favor would have required making a statement about the relationship that the palace had not yet decided to make. The institutional calculation continued to prioritize its own position over the well-being of the person at the center of the story. Harry was watching all of this from inside the institution, from the position of someone who could see what was happening to the person he loved and could not effectively stop it. His inability to stop it was not only a function of his youth, though his youth was part of it. It was a function of the specific kind of powerlessness that the institution produces in the people inside it, when those people's interests conflict with the institution's interests. Harry was not without resources. He was a prince. He had access, through his position, to some of the most sophisticated communications management in Britain. He had lawyers, he had staff, he had the institutional weight of the monarchy behind him when he needed it. What he did not have was the ability to deploy those resources in his own interest when his interest conflicted with the palace's preference. The resources were the palace's resources, managed in the palace's interest. Using them required the palace's cooperation, and the palace's cooperation was available only in directions the palace approved. Intervening publicly on Chelsy's behalf, making statements about the coverage, deploying the institutional machinery in defense of her against the tabloid assault. All of this required the palace to acknowledge the relationship as something it was prepared to use its resources to defend. That acknowledgement, in the institutional calculation, would cost the palace something it was not prepared to pay. Harry understood this. He understood it in the way people inside powerful institutions understand the limits of their position, not through formal instruction, but through the accumulated experience of reaching for a resource and finding it unavailable. He had been reaching for resources in his own interest since he was 12 years old, and finding them unavailable in the specific ways that the institution's priorities determined, and the reaching and the finding had built in him, over years, a quiet and then a less quiet frustration that was beginning to have a direction. The direction was toward a confrontation that he was not yet equipped to have. The specific incident that Harry has cited most frequently in his later accounts as crystallizing his understanding of the press relationship occurred not with Chelsy directly, but in the context of the news of the world's phone hacking. The moment when the knowledge that his private communications had been accessed by journalists without his consent settled fully into his understanding was, by his account, a moment of reorientation. The press had not been covering him from the outside. It had been inside his private life, listening to communications that no one outside the communications had consented to share. The palace's management of this knowledge, when it began to become clear that hacking had been occurring, was the management of an institution that had its own complex relationship with the press outlets doing the hacking, and was not in a clean position to confront that relationship directly. The palace's communications operation had benefited from the access for cooperation arrangement with the same outlets whose journalists were now revealed to be listening to private voicemails. The clean outrage that Harry would later perform in legal testimony and in public statements was not available to the palace's communications staff, who had to manage the knowledge of what had happened while preserving relationships they could not afford to lose. Harry did not know the full extent of the hacking in 2005 and 2006. The public knowledge of the practice's scale did not emerge until the Millie Dowler case in 2011, and the full institutional picture took longer still to assemble. But he knew enough. He knew that stories were appearing in the press that contained information no legitimate journalist could have obtained from the available sources. He knew the texture of the coverage was different from coverage assembled from observation and public information. He knew, in the way that people know things before they have evidence for them, that something was wrong with the relationship between his private life and the reporting of it. The knowledge sat in him alongside the guilt about Chelsy and the anger at the coverage and the institutional helplessness, and it added to the accumulation that was building in him across these years. The accumulation did not have a name yet. It did not have a direction or a plan. It was simply the growing mass of things that were wrong about the situation he was in, experienced from the inside by someone who had been taught since birth that the institution's management of the situation was the correct response to it. In the spring of 2006, Harry's military career reached a stage that brought the question of his and Chelsy's relationship into a new kind of public view. His regiment, the Blues and Royals, was preparing for deployment to Iraq. Harry had made clear from the beginning of his military career that he intended to serve on active deployment rather than in the ceremonial capacity that the palace might have preferred and could have arranged. The deployment question generated coverage of a kind that was different from the tabloid relationship coverage, more serious in register and more directly connected to questions of institutional significance. The coverage of the deployment question gave Harry a temporary reprieve from the relationship coverage. It also gave Chelsy a different kind of difficulty. The prospect of Harry deploying to an active combat zone was not an abstract concern. She was involved with a person who was proposing to put himself in a position of genuine physical danger, in a conflict that was, in 2006, at one of its most dangerous points. Her response to this prospect was private, expressed in the relationship rather than in public. but the press understood enough of the dynamics to report on it in ways she had not invited. The deployment itself was eventually managed, in the first instance, in a way that Harry found deeply frustrating. The Taliban's announcement that they would treat Harry's presence in Iraq as a high-value targeting opportunity meant that the military command, in consultation with the palace, determined that his deployment would pose unacceptable risk to the soldiers around him as well as to himself. The decision was framed in terms of operational security and the welfare of Harry's fellow soldiers, which was a legitimate framing, but Harry experienced it as the institution once again overriding his desire to be treated as a normal soldier rather than as a royal variable requiring special management. He was not deployed to Iraq in 2006. He was redeployed to a training role and then, eventually, in a deployment that was managed with extraordinary levels of secrecy, to Afghanistan in 2007 and 2008. The Afghanistan deployment was the palace's management of the conflict between Harry's insistence on active service and the institution's need to manage the risk his presence created. It worked, in operational terms, until a Drudge Report disclosure in the United States broke the media agreement that had kept the deployment secret, and Harry was extracted from Afghanistan after 10 weeks in Helmand province. The Afghanistan deployment is relevant to the story of Chelsy because of what it revealed about where the relationship had arrived by 2007. Harry's departure for Afghanistan, in a deployment so secret that almost no one outside a tightly controlled circle knew where he had gone, took place in a context where his relationship with Chelsy was simultaneously well known to the public and still being managed by the palace in ways that denied it the weight it had in his private life. He was deployed to an active combat zone. The person he had been with for 3 years was in Cape Town, finishing her degree, having seen him less frequently than the normal operations of a serious relationship would have allowed, managing press coverage of herself without institutional support, and aware that the palace's management of her existence in Harry's life had not fundamentally changed from the approach it had taken in the first weeks. The relationship had survived 2 years of suppression and then a further 2 years of managed disclosure, in which the management continued to serve the institution's interests rather than the people inside the relationship. By 2007, Chelsy was finishing her law degree and facing a decision about what came next that was directly shaped by the relationship and the institution attached to it. The decision was whether to relocate to England. Moving to England meant entering the palace's operational environment full-time. It meant abandoning the distance that Cape Town had provided, the life she had built there, the social world that existed outside the management apparatus. It meant becoming, in the institutional geography of royal life, someone who could be formally supervised, formally advised, formally assisted in the communications management that she had been navigating alone for 3 years. The formal assistance would arrive with conditions. It would be offered in the palace's interests and would require a level of compliance with the palace's preferences that she had been refusing for the duration of the relationship. She moved to England. She enrolled in a law program at the University of Leeds in 2007. The move was covered by the press in terms that were almost uniformly more positive than the coverage that had preceded it, which was the press's way of acknowledging that she had made the correct institutional move without stating that the correctness was institutional rather than personal. She had taken a step toward the palace's geography. The palace's media relationship rewarded the step. Harry was, by accounts from people close to him in this period, genuinely pleased that Chelsy had made the move. The geographical distance had been one of the specific stresses on the relationship, and its removal produced a period of relative stability that was visible in the public appearances they made together during 2007. These appearances were themselves a form of managed disclosure that differed from the earlier period's suppression. The palace had accepted, by 2007, that the relationship was a permanent feature of Harry's life for the foreseeable future, and had shifted its strategy from suppression to management. Management in this context meant controlling the terms and settings of the couple's public appearances rather than preventing the appearances entirely. It meant briefing the press on the relationship in terms that served the palace's preferred narrative, rather than allowing the press to construct whatever narrative the available material supported. The terms the palace preferred were the terms of a relationship progressing appropriately, at an appropriate pace, in a way that reflected well on the prince's personal development and maturity. Chelsy was presented, in the managed coverage of this period, as a serious long-term partner rather than a holiday romance, which was an acknowledgement of reality that the palace had resisted for 2 years and now deployed as a communications asset. The acknowledgement cost the palace nothing that 2 years of suppression had not already cost it, and it produced coverage that was more stable and more controlled than the coverage of the suppression period had been. What the managed disclosure did not produce was any meaningful acknowledgement of what the suppression period had done to the relationship. The institutional narrative moved from one position to another without examining the territory between them. The territory between them was where Chelsy and Harry had been living for 2 years, in the gap between the institution's management of their relationship and the relationship's actual reality, and the gap had consequences that the managed disclosure was not designed to address. The consequences were specific. The relationship had been conducted, for its first 2 years, under conditions that created in both of them a particular kind of strain. Chelsy had experienced herself as someone the institution found insufficient. Harry had experienced himself as unable to advocate effectively for someone he loved against the institution that managed his life. These experiences had not been resolved by the shift from suppression to management. They had simply been overlaid with a new management phase that carried its own tensions. Chelsy, in England, was now inside the operational environment that she had spent 3 years observing from a distance. The observation had not prepared her for the experience. The management apparatus, experienced from within rather than from the outside, was different in quality from the management apparatus observed from Cape Town. It was more pervasive, more present in the texture of daily life, and more insistent on the kind of compliance that Chelsy's character made difficult for her to provide. She was being advised on what to wear and when, by people whose job it was to advise on these things, and who believed the advice was in her interests. She was being prepared for public appearances in the way that the palace prepares people adjacent to its principals for public appearances, through instruction on protocol and positioning and the management of press interaction. She was being told, through the accumulated pressure of institutional guidance, what kind of person it was in her interests to be while she was in England with Harry. The person it was in her interests to be was not a person Chelsy Davy recognized as herself. The press, which had followed the relationship through its suppression and its managed emergence, was watching the England period with the particular attention it gives to situations where the established narrative might be developing. The established narrative was that Chelsy Davy was the serious long-term girlfriend moving toward a more formal position in Harry's life. The deviation from that narrative, when it came, would be a story of at least equal commercial value to the relationship itself. Signs of that deviation were visible, to press observers who were watching carefully, in the texture of the public appearances of 2007. The appearances were managed with considerable competence by the palace's communications operation. They showed 2 young people who were evidently comfortable with each other, who shared the easy physical manner of people who have spent significant time together and have developed the specific shorthand of a relationship that has survived pressures external to it. They also showed, to observers looking for it, a woman who was present in the managed situation but not entirely inside it, who was performing the required role with sufficient competence but without the absorption that would have made the performance invisible. Chelsy was not a natural public performer. She had never sought public life. The skills required to appear at official and semi-official events in a way that produced the desired press coverage were skills that some people develop quickly and naturally, and others develop slowly and painfully, and Chelsy was firmly in the second category. This was not a character flaw. It was a statement about who she was and what she had been before Harry, and the institution's expectation that she would rapidly acquire the necessary skills was an expectation organized around the institution's requirements rather than around any realistic assessment of what it asks of a person to become, in their mid-20s, a managed public figure for the benefit of a family they have not married into. The palace's lost control of the relationship's narrative was not, in the end, a single event. It was a process that happened across the years from 2004 to 2009, the period of the relationship's active duration. The control had been lost incrementally, First when the suppression failed to hold the story, then when the managed disclosure produced coverage the palace could shape, but not fully direct. Then when Chelsy's presence in England revealed that the management apparatus was managing a person who did not respond to management in the way the institution needed her to respond. Then when the relationship's private difficulties became visible enough to the press that the narrative of steady progress toward a conventional royal future was no longer sustainable. What the palace had lost, by the end of the England period, was the fiction it had been maintaining since the relationship began. The fiction was that Harry's private life could be managed in the same way that his public life was managed, through the careful selection of what was shown and the careful management of what was concealed. The relationship with Chelsy had resisted that management at every stage, not through active resistance in most cases, but through the simple persistence of being a real thing between two real people, and real things between real people do not conform reliably to institutional narrative preferences. The press had found the story, the finding had been managed, and then the management had become the story, and the management's failure had become the story after that. At each stage, the institution had responded with the response its resources and its reflexes made available, which was another layer of management. At each stage, the management had produced a temporary stabilization, followed by a loss of control that required another management response. Harry had watched every cycle of this. He had been inside it for 5 years. The education it provided was not the education anyone had intended to give him, but it was comprehensive, and it was specific. He now understood, in a way he had not understood at 20, the mechanism by which the institution managed the people it purported to protect. He understood the gap between what the management claimed to be doing and what it was actually doing. He understood the cost of the gap, because he had watched Chelsy pay it across 5 years. He was not yet equipped to confront what he understood. The confrontation would wait, but the understanding was now in him at a level that no subsequent management operation would fully reach, because the understanding had been built from experience rather than from instruction, and experience is the one thing institutional management cannot entirely revise. The relationship with Chelsy ended, formally, in 2009. It had ended and restarted before this, as relationships do, when the people in them are serious about each other, but the circumstances around them are sufficiently hostile to make the relationship unworkable. The final ending was not a dramatic rupture, it was the conclusion of a long mutual recognition that what they had built together was not compatible with the environment in which they were being asked to maintain it. Chelsy Davy left the story that the palace had never fully allowed her to enter. She returned to Southern Africa, completed further legal qualifications, built a career and a life that eventually included a marriage and children, entirely outside the machinery that had spent 5 years attempting to manage her into an acceptable shape. The person the palace had found insufficient went on to become exactly the person she had always been, which was sufficient for every purpose except the one the institution had in mind. Harry stayed inside the institution, carrying everything the 5 years had built in him, looking for the next person who might be capable of existing beside him in a life that the institution had not designed. The next person would also find the institution unwilling to accommodate her. The pattern would repeat. It always repeated. The institution had one response to people who did not fit its template, and the response was management, and the management produced the same result across every iteration, which was the managed person's gradual or sudden recognition that the management was not in their interest. What changed with each iteration was Harry. He was being educated. The institution was educating him in its own methods, and the education was not producing the result the institution would have chosen. It was producing the opposite. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The years between Chelsy Davy and Meghan Markle are the years that the public narrative of Harry's life tends to skip over, because they do not contain a story with the clean, dramatic shape that public narratives prefer. They contain instead a period of accumulation, of further relationships managed by the same apparatus with the same results, of a young man developing, through repeated experience, an increasingly coherent understanding of what the institution around him was doing, and what it was costing the people it touched. and of the institution itself, continuing to operate with the unchanged confidence of something that has never been successfully challenged from within. The accumulation is the story. It is less satisfying than a single rupture would be, but it is more true, and the truth of it is necessary for understanding what eventually happened. Harry was 24 years old when the relationship with Chelsy formally ended in 2009. He had spent 5 years of his adult life inside a relationship that the institution had managed against, and he had watched the management operate at close range for long enough to have a detailed understanding of its mechanics. He had not yet translated that understanding into action, because translating understanding into action inside a powerful institution requires either the resources to challenge the institution directly or the willingness to leave it, and Harry, in 2009, had access to neither. He had resources in the conventional sense. He had position, money, staff, and the considerable social capital that comes with being a prince who has served in an active combat zone and who the public, in 2009, regarded with a mixture of affection and genuine interest. What he did not have was the institutional standing to challenge the palace's management of his private life from within. The internal politics of the royal family do not function on the basis of individual preference overriding institutional assessment. They function on the basis of the institution's accumulated authority over the people inside it, an authority built across generations and maintained through the consistent expectation of compliance. Harry's compliance was becoming less consistent. This was visible to the people around him in the specific ways that a person's changing relationship with institutional authority becomes visible, not in grand gestures or explicit confrontations, but in the texture of smaller interactions, in the questions asked that had not been asked before, in the resistance offered to guidance that would previously have been accepted without friction, in the accumulating sense, communicated to the communications staff managing him, that the principal's priorities were beginning to diverge from the institution's priorities in ways that would eventually require active management. The communications staff managed this the way they managed everything, by absorbing the signals, noting them as factors in the ongoing assessment of the principal's position, and continuing to operate on the assumption that the institution's management approach was correct, and that the principal's diverging priorities were a temporary condition that would respond to appropriate guidance. They were wrong about this. The divergence was not temporary, it was structural, built from years of specific experience that no amount of guidance could revise, because the experience had already formed the understanding. But institutions committed to a management approach rarely perceive, from the inside, the distinction between a temporary divergence and a structural one. The perception of that distinction is precisely what institutional management tends to prevent. The gap year between the end of the Chelsy relationship and the beginning of the next serious involvement was not a gap year in the narrative sense. It was a period in which Harry's military career continued to develop, in which his public role as a working royal expanded as William's marriage to Catherine Middleton approached, and the redistribution of public attention that a royal wedding generates created space for Harry to define his own public identity more clearly, and in which the private education that the Chelsy years had provided settled into something more formed. He was a better soldier than the tabloid coverage of his early 20s had suggested. The second Afghanistan deployment, the one that ended when the American press broke the secrecy agreement in February 2008, had given him direct experience of what he had joined the army to experience, which was the particular form of clarity that active service provides. In Helmand Province, the institutional complications of his life in England resolved into something much simpler. The people around him were there because the mission required them. He was there because the mission required him. The hierarchy was functional rather than ceremonial. The purpose was unambiguous. He has described the Afghanistan period, across multiple later accounts, as the closest he came, in his life before leaving the institution, to feeling like an ordinary person doing an ordinary job in extraordinary circumstances. The loss of that feeling, when the deployment ended and he returned to the managed public life of a senior royal, was experienced as a specific deprivation rather than as a return to normality. This is important because it indicates how far the normalizing process of the institution had failed with Harry. The institutional environment was supposed to feel like home. Instead, it felt, by 2008, like a performance he was required to continue after the real event had ended somewhere else. The public persona he maintained in the years between the Chelsy relationship and the beginning of the relationship with Cressida Bonas was the persona of the party prince, the young royal who appeared at nightclubs and at social events with the ease of someone who enjoyed the social opportunities his position provided. The persona was not entirely false. He did enjoy those things, with the specific enjoyment of someone who has found a mode of existence that does not require him to think very carefully about the larger situation he is in. The nightclubs and the parties and the social world of young wealthy London did not ask Harry to examine the institution. They asked him only to be present and entertaining, and he was genuinely both. The persona was also, and this became more apparent over time, a surface maintained over a private life that was considerably more complicated than the surface suggested. The compressed grief of the years after Diana's death had not resolved. The institutional management of his emotions had not produced the resolution it was presumably designed to produce. The Afghanistan deployment had temporarily bypassed the compression by providing an environment in which emotional complexity was less relevant than operational competence. But the return from Afghanistan returned him to the compressed state that had been the permanent condition of his adult life. He began, in this period, to drink more than was good for him, which is a specific kind of indicator in a person who has been trained not to feel. Drinking is the solution to compression that presents itself most readily in the social world Harry was moving through, where it is not a symptom of anything, but simply what everyone does on a Wednesday evening. The drinking was not at a level that produced the kind of public incidents that generate tabloid coverage. It was at the level that produces, over time, a consistent slight blunting of the emotional clarity that a person needs to make good decisions about their life. He also began, in this period, to seek therapeutic support, which the institution around him did not actively encourage, and in some respects discouraged, through the same mechanisms by which royal institutions discourage anything that might produce a principal who is clearer about their own interests than the institution finds convenient. The therapeutic support he found was limited and intermittent in these early years, but it began a process that would eventually produce the clarity he needed. Cressida Bonas entered his life in 2012, introduced through Eugenie, who was her friend, and who had the social intelligence to understand that Harry needed to meet people who existed outside the specific pressure cooker of his immediate environment. Cressida Bonas was 23 years old at the time, the daughter of Lady Mary Gay Curzon and Christopher Bonas, and a member of the particular stratum of English upper-class social life that the palace understands as familiar territory. Her background was English, aristocratic in the casual way that English aristocracy operates in the 21st century, and connected to the world of arts and performance through her own interests in dance and theatre. The palace's initial assessment of Cressida was different from its initial assessment of Chelsy. The immediate complications that Chelsy had represented, the Zimbabwean background, the land reform context, the father's business interests, the South African geography, were not present with Cressida. She was, in the institutional checklist terms, closer to the template: English, aristocratic, familiar with the codes of the world she was entering, prepared, by upbringing, to conduct herself appropriately in the environments a prince's girlfriend was expected to navigate. The palace did not suppress the relationship with Cressida in the way it had suppressed the relationship with Chelsy. It managed the relationship's emergence differently, with a greater willingness to acknowledge it earlier, and the tone of the early coverage reflected the institutional preference signaled through the briefing network. Where Chelsy had been a complication requiring careful handling, Cressida was presented as a development that reflected well on Harry's personal maturity and his readiness for a more settled private life. Harry noticed the difference. He noticed it because it was the same machine operating on a different setting, producing different output, and the consistency of the machine was more visible when you could compare its products across two relationships. The machine had found Chelsy insufficient and had managed her accordingly. The machine found Cressida closer to sufficient and managed her accordingly. The management in both cases was organized around the institution's assessment rather than around the reality of the relationship, and the assessment in both cases was conducted by people who had never spent significant time with the woman being assessed. What Harry was observing, across this comparison, was the mechanism of the assessment itself. He was developing, through repeated exposure, a precise understanding of the criteria the institution applied, and the people who applied them, and the process by which the application of those criteria produced the management strategies that shaped his private life. The understanding was not yet one he could articulate in the terms he would later use in public, but it was present in him as something he carried in every interaction with the communications apparatus, a knowledge of what was actually operating beneath the vocabulary of guidance and advice and the management of sensitivities. The relationship with Cressida developed through 2012 and 2013 with a degree of public visibility that the Chelsy relationship had not had in its comparable early stages. They attended events together. They were photographed in ways the palace had shaped but not prevented. The coverage was warmer in register than the Chelsy coverage had been, which Cressida found somewhat easier to navigate, because the register was the register of approval rather than assessment, and approval, even when it comes from strangers in newspapers, is less corrosive to inhabit than assessment. Cressida was, by the accounts of people who knew her in this period, a person of considerable warmth and intelligence, who had entered the relationship with a genuine openness to what it involved, and a genuine affection for Harry that was visible to everyone around them. She was also a person with a private life and a creative ambition, interests in dance and performance that preceded Harry and that she had no intention of abandoning, and a temperament that responded to the management apparatus with a resistance that was less sharp than Chelsy's had been, but was nonetheless present. Her resistance was of a different kind from Chelsy's, because her position was different. Chelsy had been managed as insufficient and had responded to the management with the directness of someone who found the assessment inaccurate and said so. Cressida was managed as adequate and responded to the management with the more diffuse resistance of someone who found the adequacy itself a diminishment. Being told you are sufficient for a position you did not apply for, assessed against standards you did not agree to be assessed against, processed by a machine that is deciding your place in a narrative you have not written, is not meaningfully different from being told you are insufficient. The machine is operating on you in both cases. The verdict is different. The operation is the same. Cressida, according to people who knew her well in those years, found the operation wearing. She had come into the relationship as a person with her own identity, her own creative life, her own sense of who she was and what she wanted. The institutional machinery around Harry had a powerful tendency to absorb the identities of the people adjacent to its principle and reprocess them as institutional variables. Cressida's identity was not easily reprocessable. Her background in dance and performance had given her a self-awareness about the relationship between who she was privately and what she appeared to be publicly that the communications apparatus found difficult to work with. She was not, in the institutional term that the communications staff used, manageable in the way the position required. This was not a criticism, though it was delivered in contexts where the speaker believed they were being helpful. It was a description of the gap between what Cressida was and what the position beside Harry required. And the gap was wide enough that the people managing the position could see it clearly by 2013. Harry could also see it. He could see the gap between Cressida as a person and Cressida as the palace's assessment of her, and he could see that the gap was producing in her the same progressive wearing that it had produced in Chelsy. He was watching the same pattern operate in a different register, and the watching was producing in him a frustration that was more articulate than it had been during the Chelsy years, because he had more experience now of what he was watching. He was also watching his brother. William and Catherine had married in April 2011, in the ceremony that produced the coverage of a kind that royal weddings generate when the subject matter cooperates fully with the institutional requirements. Catherine had entered the royal world after a long relationship with William that had itself been managed through periods of difficulty, and she had emerged from that management as someone who had absorbed the institution's requirements with a facility that the palace found exemplary. The facility was genuine, not performed. Catherine was, by temperament and by the long education in royal expectations that a decade of association with William had provided, someone who understood what the institution needed from the person beside its future king, and who was prepared to provide it. The preparation was not without cost. The cost was personal and private and visible to people close to her in specific moments that did not appear in the carefully managed public coverage. But the preparation held. The public presentation was coherent and sustained, and produced the coverage the palace needed. Harry observed this. He observed that the coverage Catherine received was the coverage of a person who had passed the institutional assessment and was being rewarded with the kind of framing that the machine reserves for people it has decided to support. He observed the difference between that framing and the framing applied to Chelsy. He observed the criteria that seemed to determine which framing a person received. He observed that the criteria were real but not stated, operated but not acknowledged, and that the people who applied them believed themselves to be making reasonable judgments about suitability when they were actually applying a template that had been built over generations without anyone sitting down to examine whether the template made sense. The examination of whether the template made sense was not an activity the institution encouraged. The template was the template because it had always been the template. Challenging it required the kind of institutional confidence that the palace did not produce in the people inside it, and for good reason, because an institution that produced people willing to challenge its foundational assumptions is an institution engaged in its own dismantling. Harry was developing that confidence, slowly and at considerable personal cost, through the specific curriculum of experience the institution was providing him. Each relationship that the palace managed in its interests rather than his was adding to a body of evidence he was assembling. The evidence was not organized into an argument. It was not yet something he could present in a structured way to anyone, including himself. But it was present, and it was growing, and it was changing the way he experienced the institution's management with each iteration. The relationship with Cressida ended in 2014. The ending was not the result of a single event or a dramatic confrontation. It was the conclusion of a gradual mutual recognition that Cressida's private life and the public life attached to Harry were not compatible in a way that could be sustained. Cressida has been characteristically private about the specifics of the ending, in a way that Harry respected in his later accounts. What the ending meant, in the context of the pattern being traced here, was a second confirmation of what the Chelsy relationship had first shown. The institution was not capable of accommodating the people Harry loved in a way that left those people intact. This is a large statement, and it requires examination. The institution had, across its history, accommodated many people in the positions adjacent to its princes. It had accommodated Catherine Middleton. It had accommodated, across previous generations, women who had found the accommodation difficult and had made it work through various combinations of personal resilience, institutional compliance, and the gradual subordination of private identity to public role. The accommodation was possible. It had been demonstrated. What the institution's accommodation required, in every case where it worked, was a specific form of surrender that not every person could or should make. The surrender was not dramatic. It did not involve formal agreement or explicit instruction. It was the daily, accumulated surrender of private preference to institutional requirement, of individual temperament to institutional expectation, of who a person was before they entered the royal orbit to who the institution needed them to be while they were in it. Chelsy had not been able to make that surrender. Cressida had not been able to make it. Harry was watching both of these facts and drawing conclusions from them. The conclusions were not yet fully formed, but they were moving in a direction. The direction was toward the understanding that the problem was not with the people who could not make the surrender. The problem was with an institution that required the surrender and had never examined whether the requirement was legitimate. He had no vocabulary for this understanding yet that he could deploy in public. The vocabulary would come from an unexpected source, a woman he had not yet met, who had already, through her own life and her own choices, developed a different relationship with the question of institutional requirement than anyone in his world had modeled for him. In the period between the end of the Cressida relationship in 2014 and his meeting with Meghan Markle in 2016, Harry was in a specific state that the people around him recognized but could not fully account for. He was a senior working royal, performing his public duties with increasing effectiveness. The veterans' charity Centre, which he had founded in memory of his mother in 2006, was doing work in southern Africa that genuinely mattered to him. The Invictus Games, which he launched in 2014, was generating the kind of positive coverage and public warmth that the palace found useful and that Harry found satisfying, in the specific way that work you believe in is satisfying when it is going well. The public presentation was functioning. The private reality was considerably less settled. He was 30 years old in 2014, the year the Cressida relationship ended. He had been in 2 serious relationships, both of which had been managed by the institution, in ways that served the institution's interests, and had ended partly because of the consequences of that management. He had served in 2 combat deployments, both of which had been ended by institutional decisions that overrode his own preferences about his service. He had watched his father's marriage to Camilla gradually become institutionally acceptable after decades of the institution treating it as a complication to be managed. He had watched his mother's relationship with the institution across his childhood and had then watched the coverage of his mother's death produce a national grief that the institution had managed with the efficiency that was its permanent mode. He had been in therapy intermittently for several years, with increasing commitment and increasing result. The therapy was producing something that the institutional environment had not produced, which was a growing ability to name what he was feeling, rather than to compress it behind the surface the institution required. The naming was not comfortable. Feelings that have been compressed for years are not comfortable to name. But it was clarifying. It was building in him a self-understanding that was less organized around the institution's narrative of who he was, and more organized around his own experience. The experience told him specific things. It told him that the grief of his mother's death had not been processed, that the institutional response to that grief had been management rather than support, and that the management had produced a compression that was still present in him at 30 and was costing him more than he had previously acknowledged. It told him that the relationships he had been damaged by an institution that had treated the people he loved as communications variables rather than as people, and that the damage was real and had consequences for him as well as for them. It told him that the public persona he maintained was a managed construction that bore a specific and limited relationship to his actual experience, and that the distance between the construction and the experience was something he was increasingly unwilling to maintain without examining. The examining was happening. It was happening in therapy, in private conversations with the small number of people he trusted at that level, and in the gradual accumulation of moments in which the institution's management of his life produced a response in him that was less compliant than it had previously been. The institution, observing these signals, managed them in the way it managed all signals that pointed in a direction it did not prefer. It absorbed them, noted them, and continued operating on the assumption that the management approach was correct. It was 2015. Harry was 31 years old, single, carrying a private life more complicated than any public presentation suggested, and developing an understanding of the institution around him that the institution itself was not equipped to perceive. The people managing him saw a principal whose private life had gone through a period of difficulty and who was now stabilizing, who was performing his public duties well, who was generating positive coverage and productive charity work, and who would, with appropriate management, settle into the working royal role that his position required. What they did not see was what the Chelsy years and the Cressida years had built in him. They did not see it because they had no framework for seeing it. The institution's framework for understanding its principles is organized around the principal's public performance and its management requirements. It does not have a well-developed framework for understanding the cumulative effect on a person of years of having their private life managed in the institution's interests rather than their own. If it had developed such a framework, it might have predicted what was coming. It might have understood that a person who has watched the same pattern operate twice, who has been in therapy long enough to name what the pattern has cost, who is developing an increasingly coherent language for the gap between institutional management and his own experience, is a person approaching a threshold. The threshold is the point at which the accumulated understanding becomes large enough to act on, not in an explosion, not in a confrontation, but in a choice, a specific choice about the kind of life that is worth trying to build, and the kind of person beside whom that life might be possible. Harry had not yet made that choice in 2015. He was approaching the conditions in which the choice would become available. He was meeting people, in the social world he moved through, whose lives were organized on different principles from the institution's principles, and the contact was showing him that organization on different principles was possible, and that the people who had achieved it were not lesser for it. He was also thinking about his mother more clearly than he had been able to think about her before the therapy began to work. He was thinking about what Diana had been trying to do in the years before she died, which was to exist as a full person inside an institution that wanted to manage her as a variable, and about how that attempt had ended, and about what it meant that the institution had not changed its management approach in the 20 years since her death. The thinking was not organized into a plan. It was not yet something he could articulate to anyone as a proposed course of action. It was present as a growing sense of the terms on which he was willing to continue and the terms on which he was not. The terms on which he was not willing to continue were becoming clearer with each passing year. They involved the management of his private life in the institution's interests. They involved the suppression and the burial and the managed disclosure and the communication strategies that treated the people he loved as variables. They involved the institutional silence about his mother that had persisted across his entire adult life. They involved the phone hacking that had taken years to fully acknowledge and that the institution had managed rather than confronted with the directness he believed the situation required. He was not going to be able to continue on those terms indefinitely. The institution, which had been managing him since birth, had not built into its management approach any mechanism for accommodating this. It had been managing him as a person who would continue indefinitely on the terms available, as second sons of royal families had continued for generations, managing the gap between private life and institutional requirement with the composure that the institution rewarded and the suppression that the institution required. Harry was not going to be that person. He was still, in 2015, performing the role that person performed. He would perform it for several more years, but the performance was increasingly a performance, and the distance between it and the reality beneath it was growing in ways that would eventually produce a gap too wide to maintain. Into that gap, in the summer of 2016, walked Meghan Markle. The institution would respond to Meghan with the same management apparatus it had deployed against Chelsy and, to a lesser degree, against Cressida. It would conduct the same assessment, find a different and more complicated checklist of complications, and deploy the management strategies that its accumulated experience had produced. It would do all of this with the confidence of an institution that has been managing its principles for centuries and has no reason to doubt the adequacy of its methods. It had no way of knowing, in 2016, that the person it was about to attempt to manage was a person who had spent 2 years in a relationship with Meghan Markle, developing the clarity, the language, and the will to refuse the management in a way that no one inside the institution had predicted, and no management strategy in the institution's arsenal was designed to address. The refusal would not come immediately. It would take years, and it would cost more than either Harry or Meghan had initially understood it would cost. But it was already, in some sense, inevitable by the time they met, because the conditions for it had been built across the years that preceded it, in the Chelsy years and the Cressida years, and the therapy years and the accumulating understanding years, by an institution that had spent 2 decades educating Harry in exactly the way it should not have, if what it wanted was his permanent compliance. The institution had wanted that. It had managed toward it consistently. It had produced, through the consistency of its management, the opposite. Meghan Markle was 34 years old when she met Harry in the summer of 2016, introduced by a mutual friend at a dinner in London that neither of them had particularly expected to be significant. She was an American actress working on the television series Suits, based in Toronto, with a life and career and public identity that had been built entirely outside the royal orbit and entirely on her own terms. She had not grown up learning the codes of English aristocratic life. She had not been raised to read the signals of palace management. She had developed, through her own experience in the entertainment industry and her own choices about how to exist publicly, a relationship with institutional pressure that was entirely different from the one that the women who had previously entered Harry's life had brought with them. The difference was specific. Chelsy had resisted the palace's management from a position of instinctive refusal, the refusal of someone who found the management's logic alien and said so. Cressida had resisted it from a position of temperamental incompatibility, the wearing experience of someone whose private identity would not conform to institutional requirement. Meghan's relationship with institutional pressure was different from both of these, because Meghan had spent her adult life navigating the entertainment industry, which has its own management apparatus, and its own mechanisms of image control, and its own assessment of which people fit which templates, and she had developed, in navigating it, a fluency in the language of managed public identity that the other women had not possessed. She understood, from the beginning, what the institution was doing. She understood it not because she had read about it or been briefed about it, but because she recognized the operations. She had seen management apparatus before. She had been inside one. She knew what it looked like when an institution decided to manage a person rather than support them, and she knew the difference between the two, and the difference was one of the first things she communicated to Harry in the early months of their relationship. Harry, by 2016, was in a position to hear it. The years of therapy had done their work. Not completely, not in the way that therapy resolves everything into clear understanding and clean emotional organization, because therapy does not work like that, and anyone who describes it as doing so has not been in it long enough. But sufficiently, Harry had, by the time he met Meghan, a functioning vocabulary for his own experience that he had not had at 20 when he met Chelsy, or at 28 when he met Cressida. He could name what he felt. He could identify, in real time, the operation of the management apparatus and what it was attempting to do. He could articulate, at least in private, the gap between the institution's management of him and his own interests. The articulation was not yet public. It would not become public for several more years, and the path to its becoming public would cost more than he or Meghan had anticipated. But the internal work was done. The understanding was present. The question, in 2016, was what he was going to do with it. Meghan gave the question a new urgency, because the pattern that Harry had watched operate against Chelsy and Cressida began operating against Meghan almost immediately, and it operated against Meghan in ways that were more visible to the outside world and more clearly organized around categories that the institution would never have acknowledged explicitly, but that were legible in the management choices being made. Meghan was American. She was a working actress. She was divorced. She was the daughter of a white father and a black mother, which made her biracial, in a country where the relationship between the royal institution and race had a long and almost entirely unexamined history. She was vocal about her social views in the way that American public figures of her generation are vocal about social views, on social media, through her philanthropic work, through the public positions she took on questions of gender equality and global health. She had an independence of public voice that the palace found immediately problematic, because the palace's approach to the public voices of people adjacent to its principles is to manage those voices into institutional alignment, and Meghan's voice was not organized around institutional alignment. It was organized around her own values and her own judgments, which were real and considered, and entirely outside the institution's control. The assessment the palace conducted of Meghan was, in the terms of its assessment criteria, more complicated than the assessment it had conducted of either Chelsy or Cressida. The complication was not primarily about her background, though her background generated complications in the specific way that backgrounds which do not match the institutional template always generate complications. The complication was primarily about the fact that Meghan was already public, in a way that Chelsy and Cressida had not been, and her existing public identity was not one the palace had shaped or could easily reshape. With Chelsy, the palace had managed the emergence of a private person into public view, controlling the terms and timing of that emergence with the tools the institution had developed for exactly that purpose. With Cressida, the emergence had been somewhat faster, but had followed broadly similar management principles. With Meghan, the emergence was not a managed transition from private to public. It was a collision between two existing public identities, Meghan's own, and the one the palace would attempt to build around her, and the collision was immediate and public, and generated coverage that the palace's management apparatus was not equipped to process. The coverage began within weeks of the relationship becoming known. It was not the coverage the palace had briefed for, because the palace had not fully briefed in the period before the story broke, having miscalculated the speed at which the story would find its way into print. When the story appeared, in the autumn of 2016, it appeared in multiple outlets simultaneously, in a form the palace had not shaped, carrying the particular register that the British tabloid press applies to stories it has found, rather than stories it has been given. The register was not kind. The coverage of Meghan in the first months of the relationship's public existence drew on the specific vocabulary that the tabloid press deploys against women who enter royal orbits from outside the expected categories. It drew on her American identity, her acting career, her previous marriage, and, in ways that were specific and clear to anyone with sufficient familiarity with the British press's history of covering people of color, on her racial background. The coverage did not state its racial framework explicitly. It operated through implication, through the specific word choices and the particular questions asked and the categories invoked, in a way that communicated the framework without technically stating it. Harry read the coverage. He had been reading coverage of the women he was with for 12 years, since the first Chelsy coverage in 2004. He had watched the press construct Chelsy as a complication and Cressida as a question mark. He was now watching the press construct Meghan in a framework that was similar in structure to those earlier constructions and different in the specific categories it was deploying. The difference registered. It registered against the background of everything the Chelsy years had built in him, the understanding of how the management apparatus worked and whose interests it served and what it cost the people it operated on. The understanding that had been building for 12 years was now encountering its clearest example, and the encounter produced in Harry something more than the frustration and helplessness he had felt during the Chelsy years. It produced a decision. The decision was not made all at once. Decisions of this scale are never made all at once. They are made in the accumulation of smaller decisions, each one slightly more committed than the last, until the accumulation reaches a mass that the earlier, more cautious position cannot support. Harry's decision was made across 2016 and 2017 and 2018 and 2019, in a series of steps that each seemed manageable from the inside, and that together were taking him somewhere the institution had never anticipated he would go. The first step was the public statement he released in November 2016, in which he directly addressed the media coverage of Meghan and named what he saw happening. The statement described the racial undertones of the coverage, the sexist treatment, and the harassment Meghan had been subjected to. It was the kind of statement the palace's communications staff would not have written and would not have recommended, because palace communications does not typically confront the press directly in language that names specific editorial failures. It is not designed to work that way. It is designed to manage relationships with the press, not to confront them. Harry wrote the statement anyway. It was, in the terms of his relationship with the institution, an act of a different quality from anything he had done before. He had spent 12 years watching the palace manage the coverage of the women he was with, watching the management serve the institution's interests while the women paid the costs, and he had been unable to effectively challenge it. With Meghan, the challenge came out of him before the institutional caution could contain it, in the form of words that named what he saw clearly, and sent them into public record, without the management apparatus's approval. The palace's communications staff reacted to the statement with the management response that the management apparatus applies to events it has not controlled, which is to absorb the statement into the institutional narrative, present it as consistent with Harry's character and his protective instincts, and move the conversation forward as quickly as possible. The presentation was not entirely false. The statement was consistent with Harry's character, but its origin was not the managed, approved, institutionally coordinated decision that the palace's presentation implied. It was Harry acting on his own judgment, against the management grain, in a way that the institution noted and filed as a signal requiring careful future handling. The signal was the same signal that had been accumulating for years. The principal's priorities were diverging from the institution's priorities. The divergence was increasing. The management approach had not changed. Harry and Meghan married in May 2018, in the ceremony at Windsor Castle, that generated the specific kind of global coverage that royal weddings produce at their most successful. The coverage was positive, in the way that the institution's coverage of weddings it endorses is positive, shaped by the briefing network and the managed access and the accumulated relationship between the palace communications operation and the royal press corps. Meghan's dress and her demeanor, and the presence of her mother in the chapel, and the extraordinary performance by the American gospel choir were all elements of a ceremony that produced, for a brief period, coverage that was warmer toward Meghan than almost anything that had preceded it. The warmth did not last. It rarely does in the institutional coverage of royal marriages, where the warmth of the wedding is followed by the assessment of the working relationship, and the assessment applies criteria that the wedding coverage suspended. The assessment of Meghan as a working member of the royal family, conducted across the year following the wedding, produced coverage that drew on sources within the palace and within the wider royal household, who were speaking to journalists in ways that had the familiar texture of institutional briefing against a principle rather than in support of one. Harry recognized the texture. He had been watching it operate for 12 years. He had watched it operate against Chelsy in 2004 and 2005, when sources within his social circle had spoken to journalists in ways that produced the coverage the palace preferred. He had watched it operate against Cressida. He was now watching it operate against his wife, in the specific form it takes when the institution has decided that the person being covered is a complication requiring management rather than a member requiring support. The management against Meghan was more consequential than the management against Chelsy or Cressida, because Meghan was not a girlfriend who could eventually leave. She had married Harry. She was carrying his child. She was a member of the institution in a formal sense that the previous women had not been. The management apparatus was operating against someone who was, legally and constitutionally, inside the institution, and the operation was producing in Meghan consequences that went beyond the wearing experience Chelsy and Cressida had described. It was producing a mental health crisis that was real and serious, and that was met, by the institution, with the response the Windsor family gives to mental health crises, which is the response of an institution that has not developed adequate resources for confronting them. Harry has described this period in detail that is specific and consistent across multiple accounts. Meghan was struggling. She was asking for help. The help she was asking for was the kind of help that a large institution with extensive resources and a duty of care toward its members is equipped to provide, the kind of professional mental health support that any responsible employer would make available. The institution's response to the request was managed in the same way the institution manages everything, through a calculation of what the provision of that support would communicate publicly and what its absence would cost, rather than through a calculation of what was needed. What was needed was not what was provided. Harry has been direct about this, more direct than the institution found comfortable, across his memoir and his interviews and his testimony in legal proceedings. The directness was not the directness of someone performing grievance for public consumption. It was the directness of someone who had spent 20 years watching an institution manage people in its interests rather than theirs, who had finally reached the point where the management was affecting the person he had chosen to build a life with, and who had developed, through 20 years of institutional education, exactly the language required to name what was happening. The naming was the thing the institution had never anticipated, not the departure, which institutions can manage, absorbing exits, and continuing to operate with the smooth confidence of something that has outlasted all its previous challenges. The naming was what the institution could not absorb, because the naming was specific, and it was public, and it was delivered by someone who had been inside the institution for 35 years and had accumulated, across those years, an understanding of its operations that no communication strategy could plausibly contest. Harry and Meghan left the frontline royal role in January 2020, in the announcement that the press called Megxit, and that the palace managed with the efficiency it brings to managing events it did not control, by presenting the departure as a mutually agreed development that reflected the Sussex couple's wishes and the family's support for those wishes. The presentation required considerable management effort, because the reality of the departure was considerably less mutually agreed than the presentation suggested, and the gap between the presentation and the reality was one that Harry and Meghan would eventually close publicly in ways the palace had not anticipated. The closing began with the Oprah Winfrey interview in March 2021. The interview produced a conversation that the palace found deeply uncomfortable because it named, in clear language and before a global audience of estimated hundreds of millions, the specific operations of the institutional machinery that Harry had spent 2 decades learning to understand. Meghan described the experience of asking for mental health support and not receiving it. She described the specific concern that had been expressed within the institution about what her child's skin color might be, a concern that was communicated to Harry and that he subsequently confirmed was real and had been expressed by a member of the family. The confirmation, delivered in Harry's characteristically direct manner, produced a response from the institution that was managed with the care the institution applies to its most serious communications challenges. The managed response could not undo the interview. It could position the palace's reaction, issue statements about the matters raised being privately discussed within the family, present a version of events that competed with the interview's version in the coverage that followed. It could not reach the underlying reality, because the underlying reality was not a communications problem. It was a 20-year accumulation of institutional conduct that had been named by someone with the standing and the evidence to name it. Harry's memoir, published in January 2023, was the full accounting that the Oprah interview had previewed. It was 416 pages of specific, detailed, first-person description of the experiences that had built the understanding he was now deploying. The Chelsy years were in it. The management of the relationship, the burial, the holiday romance framing, the coverage, the hacking of private communications, the institutional silence about what was being done to the person he loved. The Cressida years were in it. The therapy years were in it. The Afghanistan deployments and the management of those deployments, and the specific feeling of return from Helmand Province to the palace's managed environment were in it. The years of watching the institution operate against Meghan were in it, in the detail of specific incidents and specific decisions and specific moments when the management apparatus made choices that served the institution and cost the people inside it something real. The memoir was not a perfect document. It contained passages that were more revealing than useful, moments where the specificity of the accounting crossed from clarifying into settling scores in ways that complicated the larger argument. It contained accounts of interactions with family members that those family members disputed, which produced exactly the kind of he said they said coverage that palace communications staffs are experienced at managing and that temporarily obscured the more important parts of what Harry was saying. The more important parts were the structural parts, the description of the management apparatus and how it operated and whose interests it served and what it cost. Those parts were not disputable in the way that the accounts of specific conversations were disputable. They were confirmed by the pattern of Harry's experiences across 3 decades and across multiple relationships and multiple institutional encounters, a pattern that was coherent and consistent and organized around a single observation that was simpler than the coverage of the memoir acknowledged. The observation was this: the institution managed Harry in its interests. It managed the people around Harry in its interests. The management was not malicious in intent, but it was systematic in operation and consistent in result, and the result was the progressive diminishment of the people it touched, the compression of their private selves into institutional variables, the replacement of their actual experience with the managed version the institution preferred to present. Harry had been the product of that management since birth. The Chelsy years had shown him the mechanism. The Cressida years had confirmed it. The therapy years had given him the language. The Meghan years had given him the reason to use the language publicly, because watching the mechanism operate against his wife, with the consequences it produced, had moved the decision from the abstract to the concrete. What the buried years made Harry become was not a rebel, though the institutional framing of his departure reached consistently for that word. It was not a victim, though the coverage of his interviews and his memoir reached just as consistently for that one. The categories that the coverage deployed against him were the same categories the coverage deploys against anyone who challenges an institution from the inside, the categories that position the challenger as either dangerously destabilizing or embarrassingly self-pitying, that reduce the challenge to personality and grievance, and therefore make it easier to dismiss. The challenge was not about personality. it was about the mechanism. Harry became, through the specific education the institution's management had provided across 20 years, the person inside the institution who could describe the mechanism from direct experience, in specific terms, with the standing that comes from having been inside it, and with the will to make the description public that came from having watched the mechanism operate against too many people he loved for too long. That is a specific thing to become. It is not the thing the institution intended when it began managing him at 12 years old, processing his mother's death in the institutional vocabulary of composure and forward motion. It is not the thing the palace's communications staff believed they were producing when they buried the Chelsy relationship in 2004 and 2005 and called the burial protective management. It is not the thing the briefing network expected to produce when it communicated its sensitivities to royal correspondents, and the correspondents duly managed their coverage in the directions the sensitivities implied. The institution produced, through the consistency and the comprehensiveness of its management, someone who understood the management and refused it. The refusal cost him his position, his proximity to his family, his country of residence, and more than the public coverage of the departure has ever fully acknowledged. The burial of the Chelsy years was the first lesson. The lesson was that the institution would manage the people he loved as variables and call the management protection. The lesson was that the management served the institution's interests, and that the institution's interests and his interests were not the same thing. The lesson was that the gap between those interests was real and was growing, and would eventually require him to choose between them. He chose. The choosing took 20 years, 3 relationships, 2 combat deployments, sustained therapeutic work, a marriage, children, a memoir, and a legal confrontation with the press, whose phone hacking the institution had managed rather than challenged. The choosing required all of it, because the institution's conditioning was deep, and the confidence required to act against it had to be built from equally deep experience. Chelsy Davy is in her late 30s now, living a life that has nothing to do with royal management or palace communications or the maintenance of the institutional template. She has a career, a family, a public identity that is hers rather than the institution's construction of her. The years when the palace buried her existence in Harry's life are not the years she defines herself by, according to the limited public statements she has made on the subject, though they are the years that shaped, in Harry, the beginning of the understanding he would eventually act on. She does not appear to hold the burial against him. This is not a small thing. The burial was, from her side of it, the experience of a powerful institution deciding that her existence in a relationship she took seriously was an embarrassment requiring management, and then managing it accordingly for 2 years, and then managing its disclosure in a frame she did not consent to, and then failing to provide the institutional support that would have helped her navigate the consequences of the disclosure, and doing all of this while describing the management as being in her interests, and Harry's interests, and the interests of everyone involved. It was not in her interests. It was not in Harry's interests. It was in the institution's interests, and the institution had never, in its management of the situation, examined whether those were the same thing. The examination came later. It came in therapy rooms, and in private conversations, and in the slow accumulation of understanding across 2 decades of managed experience. It came, eventually, in a memoir, and an interview, and a legal case, and the systematic public account of what the institution had done, and what it had cost, and what the accounting required. The institution is still there. It has absorbed the challenge with the composure that centuries of practice produce, issuing its statements and managing its coverage, and continuing to operate on the management principles that produced the Chelsy burial and everything that followed it. It has a new king and a new queen consort, and a future king and a future queen consort, and the management apparatus around all of them is functioning with the efficiency that it has always brought to these things. What it also has, in the public record, is a complete and specific account of how the apparatus operates and what the operation costs, delivered by someone who spent 35 years inside it, with the access and the standing and the motivation to make the account as accurate as the experience it documents. That account is available to anyone who reads it. It does not require endorsement from the institution to be read or understood. It stands in the public record independent of whatever counter-narrative the palace's communications operation has built or is building around it. The buried years produced that account. The palace buried Chelsy Davy in 2004 because she was a complication requiring management. The management it deployed to bury her educated the person it was supposed to serve, one lesson at a time, across 20 years, until the education was complete and the person was ready to speak. The institution had no mechanism for anticipating this. It is not designed to anticipate it. It is designed to manage, and management in the palace's understanding means controlling the present and the immediate future. The long-term consequences of sustained management of a person's private life were not in the calculation. They were in Harry. There is a specific quality to the moment when private knowledge becomes public record. The knowledge itself does not change in that moment. The facts established in a courtroom were facts before the courtroom established them. The hacking happened when it happened. The voicemails were accessed when they were accessed. The stories were written from information no legitimate journalism could have produced, and they were published when they were published. And the people whose private communications were listened to knew, in the way people know things before they have evidence for them, that something was wrong with the texture of the coverage long before any court told them they were right. What changes when private knowledge becomes public record is its status. It moves from the category of things that are known but deniable to the category of things that are established and permanent. The institution that benefited from the deniability loses the deniability. The person who carried the private knowledge for years finds that the carrying has produced something with weight and consequence in the world rather than only inside themselves. Harry carried his private knowledge about the phone hacking for approximately 2 decades before it became public record. The carrying was not passive. He was, across those 2 decades, actively pursuing the legal mechanisms that would convert what he knew into what could be established, through a process that consumed resources, time, and the considerable emotional cost of revisiting years he had spent considerable effort moving through and beyond. The legal process that produced the public record had several distinct phases, and understanding them matters for understanding what the courtroom eventually confirmed and what it means for the story of the buried years. The first phase was the broad public acknowledgement of phone hacking as an institutional practice at News International, the Rupert Murdoch-owned company that published the news of the world and The Sun. This acknowledgement came in stages between 2011 and 2014, driven by the Millie Dowler case, the Leveson inquiry, and the criminal proceedings against journalists and executives, including Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson. The criminal proceedings established that phone hacking had been widespread, that it had been known to senior editorial staff, and that the coverage of the practice as limited to a single rogue reporter had been a managed fiction maintained by News International, with the cooperation of a police force that had its own institutional relationships with the press to protect. Harry was watching these proceedings with the specific attention of someone whose private life had been inside the practice. He was not a named party in the early criminal proceedings. He was not yet in a position to make the full legal intervention that would come later. He was observing, from inside the institution, the public dismantling of a fiction that the institution had participated in maintaining, and the observation was producing in him a clarity about the relationship between the palace and the press that complemented the clarity he had been developing about the palace's management of his private life. The connection between the two clarities was not coincidental. The press's phone hacking of Harry's communications had been facilitated, in part, by the same institutional arrangement that had governed the palace's management of the Chelsy relationship. The palace maintained relationships with the press outlets that were hacking Harry's phone. The briefing network through which the palace managed its coverage of Harry's private life was a network that included people at the organizations whose journalists were listening to his voicemails. The same system that suppressed the Chelsy relationship communicated through the same channels to the same outlets whose staff were accessing Harry's private communications to find the stories that the suppression was supposed to prevent. This overlap is not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. It is a description of how the system worked. The palace briefing network and the press hacking operation were not coordinated. They did not require coordination to produce the results they produced, because they were operating within the same institutional ecology. the ecology in which access and information moved between the palace and the press, on terms that served both parties, and that was enforced by the mutual interest both parties had in the continuation of the arrangement. Harry's understanding of this ecology had been building across the years of the Chelsy relationship and the years that followed it. The phone hacking proceedings gave that understanding a public structure it had not previously had. He could now see, in the documented evidence emerging from the Leveson inquiry and the subsequent criminal trials, the specific mechanism by which his private life had been penetrated during the years when the palace was simultaneously managing his private life in the institution's interests. The first civil legal action Harry took that was directly relevant to this story was his claim against Mirror Group newspapers, the publisher of the Daily Mirror, Sunday Mirror, and People. The claim covered alleged phone hacking and other unlawful information gathering across a period that included the years of the Chelsy relationship. Harry brought the claim alongside other claimants whose cases were grouped together for the purposes of the civil proceedings, a grouping that reflected both the efficiency of managing multiple related claims together and the particular weight of having a prominent claimant whose case could establish principles applicable to the others. The case came to trial in the High Court in London in May 2023. Harry's decision to give evidence in person, rather than relying on a written statement, was a decision of considerable significance that the palace observed with the discomfort it brings to anything it has not managed into its preferred form. A member of the royal family giving evidence in a civil court was itself a historical event of a kind the institution was not accustomed to managing. The last senior royal to give evidence in court before this occasion was the Prince of Wales, who would become King Edward VII in 1891, in circumstances entirely different in nature. Harry entered the witness box on the 6th of June 2023. He was 38 years old. He had been working toward this moment, through legal preparation and personal commitment to the proceedings, for years. The courtroom was the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, a building of sufficient institutional gravity to make most witnesses feel the weight of the occasion. Harry did not appear to feel it as inhibition. He appeared to feel it as the arrival of something he had been waiting for. His evidence covered a range of articles and the unlawful information gathering that had allegedly produced them. It covered his time as a younger royal, his military career, his relationships. It covered Chelsy Davy specifically, in the terms that the legal proceedings required, which are the terms of specific articles, specific information, and the question of how that information could have been obtained by any means other than unlawful access to private communications. He described, in the witness box, the effect of the coverage on the relationship with Chelsy. He described the sense, developed during those years, that communications he believed to be private were not private, that conversations held in what should have been the ordinary intimacy of a relationship were available to strangers in editorial offices who were using them to write stories. He described this experience in terms that were specific and that carried the emotional texture of someone speaking from direct experience rather than from legal briefing. He was cross-examined by counsel for Mirror Group newspapers over the course of several hours, in the manner that civil litigation cross-examination takes when the opposing side has prepared thoroughly and believes the claimant's evidence can be challenged on specific points. The cross-examination was vigorous. It questioned the basis for Harry's belief that specific articles had been produced through hacking, challenged the causal links between the private information in the articles and the communications that had allegedly been accessed, and probed the consistency of Harry's account across different statements and interviews he had given over the years. Harry maintained his account under cross-examination with a composure that the courtroom observers noted, and that was different in quality from the institutional composure the palace had trained into him. Institutional composure is maintained through suppression of the underlying feeling, through the application of controlled surface over whatever is happening internally. The composure Harry maintained in the witness box appeared to come from a different source, from the clarity of someone who has spent years developing an accurate understanding of events, and is now giving that understanding in a context designed to test it. He was not shaken on the central account. He was specific. He was consistent. He had the particular advantage of someone whose testimony is grounded in actual experience rather than in a constructed narrative, which is that actual experience has a texture and a detail that constructed narratives find difficult to replicate under sustained questioning. The judgment was handed down by Mr. Justice Fancourt in October 2023. It found that Mirror Group newspapers had engaged in unlawful information gathering in relation to Harry across multiple articles. It found that the hacking had occurred and that its effects on Harry's life had been real and demonstrable. Harry was awarded damages of £140,600, a sum that was significant in legal terms, and that he has said he would donate to charitable causes, reflecting his stated position that the money was not the point of the litigation. The point of the litigation was the public record. The judgment established, in the terms of legal finding rather than allegation or inference, that the private communications of Prince Harry had been accessed unlawfully by journalists at Mirror Group newspapers during a period that included the years when Kensington Palace was suppressing his relationship with Chelsy Davy. The two facts sit together in the public record now: the institutional suppression of the relationship and the press penetration of the private communications that the relationship generated, and their simultaneous presence in the same period tells something about the environment in which the buried years occurred that neither fact alone would convey. Harry was not only being managed by the palace during those years, he was also being surveilled by the press. The surveillance was unlawful, the management was institutional. Both were operating simultaneously, in the same period, using some of the same channels and some of the same relationships, producing coverage of his private life that was the product of both the palace's management decisions and the press's unlawful access to his communications. Chelsy was inside both of these operations simultaneously. She was being managed as a variable by the palace and surveilled as a story by the press, and she was doing this without knowing the full extent of either operation, without institutional support to navigate either, and without having chosen to be in a position where either applied to her. She had chosen to be in a relationship with a person she cared about. The rest had arrived with him. The second major legal development was the settlement with News Group newspapers, the publisher of The Sun and the former publisher of the News of the World, which was announced in December 2023. The settlement was significant beyond its financial terms, which were not disclosed, because it included something the institution had never produced and the press had never previously offered in relation to the hacking of royal communications. It included an apology. The apology appeared on the front page of The Sun, the newspaper that had been among the most aggressive in its coverage of Harry and Meghan across the years of their relationship and marriage and departure. The apology acknowledged unlawful activities by journalists at the newspapers concerned. It expressed regret for what Harry had experienced. It was worded with the careful precision of a legal document, which it partly was, but it was also a public acknowledgement, in the specific terms of apology rather than denial, that what Harry had been saying about the press had been accurate. The palace's communications staff managed their public response to the settlement with the careful neutrality the institution applies to events it finds complicated. The settlement was Harry's legal matter. The family welcomed the resolution of legal proceedings. The institution's relationship with News Group newspapers was a matter the institution was not going to address directly in the context of Harry's settlement. The management response communicated everything it needed to communicate about the institution's position without stating any of it. Harry's own public statement on the settlement was different in register from the palace's management response. It named what had happened. It described the hacking as part of a pattern of conduct that had affected his life from childhood. It described the settlement not as a conclusion, but as a confirmation, a legal and institutional acknowledgement of facts he had been carrying for 2 decades. He described what the acknowledgement meant in terms that were personal and specific and organized around the impact on his life, rather than around the legal technicalities of the settlement. He mentioned Chelsy by name in the legal context of his evidence. The name appearing in the public record of a legal proceeding gave the buried years a formal presence in the documented history of the period that they had not had before. Chelsy Davy had been managed out of the public narrative in 2004 and 2005 by an institution that found her presence inconvenient. She reappeared in the public record in 2023, in the transcript of evidence given by the man who had loved her in those years, in the context of a legal proceeding that established that the private communications of their relationship had been accessed without consent. The appearance in the legal record is not the same as the appearance in the tabloid coverage of 2005. The tabloid coverage of 2005 was the institution's managed disclosure of a relationship on the institution's preferred terms. The legal record of 2023 is a documented account of what was done to that relationship and to the people inside it, in terms that carry the specific authority of a court's findings rather than the managed authority of a palace briefing. The phone hacking case also illuminated, with a clarity that the years of press coverage had not produced, the specific mechanism by which the institution's management of Harry's private life and the press's unlawful penetration of that private life had operated in the same space. The palace had briefed the press on the terms and timing of the disclosure of the Chelsy relationship. The press had simultaneously been listening to Harry and Chelsy's private communications. The briefing and the hacking were not coordinated, but they were conducted by parties who maintained a relationship with each other, who moved information between them through channels that served both their interests, and who operated within a system that neither of them had designed, but both of them had sustained and benefited from. The Leveson inquiry had examined this system and produced a report that recommended its reform. The recommendations had not been fully implemented, in a failure of political will that Harry has consistently cited as one of the central unresolved injuries of the hacking period. The phone hacking cases brought by Harry and others were, in part, the consequence of that failure, the legal mechanism that applied in the absence of the regulatory reform that the Leveson recommendations would have provided. Harry has been direct about this in his public statements, in ways that the institution has found uncomfortable, because the directness implicates the political relationships that the palace maintains with the governments that chose not to implement Leveson's recommendations. The palace does not comment on political decisions. Its relationship with the press, built across decades of access arrangements and briefing networks, and the mutual interests that sustain institutional relationships, is not a relationship the palace is positioned to examine publicly without examining itself. Harry's insistence on examining it publicly was, from the institution's perspective, another form of the destabilization that his departure had been. From Harry's perspective, the examination was the point. The legal proceedings had produced a public record that named what had been done during the buried years, that established it as fact rather than allegation, that placed it in a context that connected the palace's management of his private life with the press's unlawful penetration of that life in a way that illuminated both. The connection is what the institution cannot fully absorb, because absorbing it would require examining the extent to which the palace's own management practices had created conditions that the press's hacking operation had exploited. It would require examining the briefing network and the access arrangements and the mutual interests that had made the tabloid ecology in which the hacking occurred a functioning system rather than an aberration. It would require, in short, the kind of institutional self-examination that powerful institutions are not designed to perform and have no established mechanism for conducting. Harry has performed that self-examination in public, across his memoir and his interviews and his legal testimony, drawing on the specific knowledge of someone who was inside the institution for 35 years and observed its operations from a position close enough to see the details. The self-examination is not perfect. No self-examination conducted in public and in the context of personal grievance is perfect. It contains the distortions that personal history always introduces into the account of institutional behavior. It also contains a large amount of accurate and specific information about how the management apparatus worked and whose interests it served and what it cost. The court agreed with him on the facts most relevant to the legal proceedings. The judge found that the hacking had occurred. The settlement acknowledged that unlawful activities had taken place. The public record now contains, in the specific language of legal findings and settlement terms, the confirmation that what Harry had been saying about the period of the buried years was, in its factual essentials, correct. The institution that buried Chelsy Davy in 2004 and 2005 did so in the confidence that the burial was manageable and would remain contained within the institutional control it had always exercised over these matters. The confidence was not irrational. The institution had managed similar situations before, without the management becoming the subject of legal proceedings or public accounting. The management was the norm. The norm was sustainable because the people it operated on were inside the institution or adjacent to it, operating within systems that discouraged challenge, and without the resources or the distance or the clarity of understanding to bring the challenge that would eventually make the norm visible. Harry was all of those things when the burial happened. He was inside the institution, without the distance, without the clarity, without the language. He had none of those things in 2004, and the institution's confidence that he would never fully develop them was not unreasonable, given the history of how second sons of royal families develop, which is typically in the direction of managed compliance rather than public accounting. The confidence turned out to be wrong, for the specific reasons that part 1 of this account traced, and that every part since has developed. The institution produced, through the consistency of its management, the conditions for its own most detailed public examination. It educated Harry in its methods by applying them to him and to the people he loved across 35 years, and the education eventually produced the opposite of compliance. The courtroom was where the education arrived at its public conclusion, not as a verdict against the institution directly, because the proceedings were against Mirror Group newspapers and News Group newspapers rather than against the palace, but as a public record that placed the buried years in a documented context. That established what had been done and confirmed that Harry's account of what had been done was accurate, and that gave to the years of institutional management and press surveillance a legal weight that the management and surveillance had never anticipated being given. The institution is still managing. The press is still operating. The relationships between them are still functioning through the access arrangements and briefing networks and mutual interests that have governed them across decades. The norm has not been reformed in the ways that the Leveson recommendations envisaged, and that Harry has consistently advocated. What has changed is the public record. The buried years are in it now. The hacking is in it. The management is in it. The cost is in it, described in the specific terms of a first-person account by the person who was inside it, and confirmed in the specific terms of legal findings by courts that examined the evidence. Chelsy Davy went back to Southern Africa after the relationship ended in 2009, and built the life she had been building before the institution reached her. Harry went to California and built the life he had been working toward since the first lessons of the Chelsy years began his education. The institution stayed where it had always been, managing the next set of variables with the efficiency it has always brought to these things. The buried years were not buried anymore. They were in the courtroom record, and in the memoir, and in the settlement apology published on the front page of a newspaper that had spent years covering Harry and Meghan, in a register that the settlement acknowledged had sometimes relied on information obtained unlawfully. The acknowledgement was the confirmation. The confirmation was what the legal process had been built to produce. Harry had carried the private knowledge of what those years contained for 2 decades, through the Cressida years, and the therapy years, and the Meghan years, and the departure, and the interview, and the memoir, and the litigation. He had carried it long enough. The courtroom had taken it from him and given it to the public record, where it now sits with the specific permanence of documented fact, available to anyone who wants to understand what the buried years were, and what they built, and what they eventually required to be named. The naming took 20 years, and a legal system, and the sustained commitment of someone who had been educated by the institution in exactly the knowledge required to challenge it. The education had been thorough. The challenge was specific. The record is permanent. The room without the floor plan is still there. It exists in every institution that has operated long enough to develop the confidence that comes from having managed everything before. It exists in the gap between what is said publicly and what is decided privately, between the statement issued and the conversation that produced it, between the guidance offered and the calculation behind the offering. The people who work inside it do not think of themselves as occupying a room without a name. They think of themselves as doing their jobs correctly, which is what people inside institutions almost always think when the institution's interests and the people's interests have been aligned for long enough that the alignment feels like nature rather than choice. Chelsy Davy walked near that room in 2004 and was processed by it in the way private people are processed by institutional machinery that has decided they represent a variable requiring management. She was 20 years old. She was in a relationship she took seriously, with a person she genuinely cared for, and the institution attached to that person had decided, without consulting her, that she was best managed toward invisibility. She did not disappear. The management did not produce its intended result, because management of that kind rarely produces its intended result when the people inside it are real rather than institutional abstractions, and Chelsy Davy was entirely real in ways the institution had no framework for accommodating. What the management produced instead was the slow education of the person it was supposed to serve. Harry is 40 years old now. He lives in California with his wife and 2 children, in a life the institution did not design and cannot manage. He has given the public a detailed account of the management apparatus and how it works, in terms that are specific and documented and confirmed in the relevant parts by legal proceedings that cost him years of sustained effort to pursue. The institution absorbed the account with the composure of something that has outlasted every previous challenge to it. The composure is genuine. The institution has outlasted more significant challenges than Harry, and it knows this, and the knowledge gives it a patience with challenge that individual challengers rarely match. What the institution cannot outlast is the public record. The record accumulates. It does not compress or manage or bury. It sits in the specific permanence of documented fact and awaits the attention of anyone who wants to understand what happened in the years when a young woman from Zimbabwe was decided to be an embarrassment by people who had never met her, and when a prince who loved her was told, in the vocabulary of guidance and protection, to let the management apparatus handle it. He let it handle it. He was 20 years old, and he had no other option available to him. He found other options later. They cost him everything the institution valued, and gave him everything the institution could not provide, which was a life that belonged to him rather than to the room without the floor plan. The room is still running. The record is permanent. Both things are true, and the distance between them is exactly the distance Harry spent 20 years crossing. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.